Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'll give us just a minute or two as more people are entering the waiting room, and we'll get started in just a second.
Dennis, you want to introduce yourself as I don't
Sure.
think most of the people here know you as in your new PAG role.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, and I'm sure more people will join as we continue on, but thank you. My name's Dennis Sills. I use he, him pronouns. I work for Plymouth Housing as the Director of Strategic Initiatives and Government Relations. And I have I've been part of the PAG for quite some time, but am joining now as co-chair of the PAG. So the Policy Advisory Group to HDC, and really excited to have this opportunity to talk about policies for the next 2 days. I think we've got some really great panels, and we're thrilled that you're all here. If you have any questions at any point, please enter them into the chat and we'll respond to you as soon as we can. But we can get forward and get moving forward with the program. We will start with a land acknowledgement. We would like to open this convening by recognizing that we are on the unceded ancestral lands of the Coast Salish peoples, the traditional home of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Squamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. We thank these caretakers of this land who have lived and continue to live here since time immemorial. So as I mentioned, I will be helping us through this discussion and moderating the first panel. Just a few technical notes. This session is being recorded. Please add your name and organization into the chat. Stay on mute other than discussion sections or to ask a question. You can also ask questions through the chat. We'll be monitoring that. Please utilize the chat box for discussion questions. We will be using polls as our main prioritization tool. Direct chat Nathan HDC for any other tech support or issues that you're having. So this is our agenda for today. We are going to do a quick welcome right now. We're going to talk about grounding our work, and I'll introduce the person that will be discussing that in just a second. At 9:35, then we will do a panel on transformative investments for affordable housing. We'll do a second panel on advancing affordability and equity through land use. And then we'll do a member discussion and poll, and we will close following that. So right now I'd like to introduce the Executive Director of HDC, Patience Malaba, who will walk us through the agenda setting process that we'll be doing for the next few days. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dennis, and thank you for stepping up to lead the work of the Policy Advisory Group. We always appreciate PAG chairs because you have an instrumental role in really driving our advocacy work. It is my great honor to welcome all of you to the 2-day policy summit, which, as all of you know, or many of you know, that this is the midpoint in setting our advocacy agenda for the following year. And in doing so, this is work that is guided by the Policy Advisory Group. And I do want to just say hats off to all of you PAG members for guiding and stewarding the process in support of HDC staff. As all of you know, it starts off with the conversations and filtering and preparation of a draft agenda that PAG does, which leads us to the policy summit where we are today. And coming out of the summit, the PAG will be reconvening to create a recommendation that will move to the board and the board will be voting on the recommendation on September 7th at their meeting, and on September 16th, collectively, as the movement of HDC will be adopting the final advocacy agenda for the next year. Now, the process aims to produce collectively a bifurcated product, which is a lead and support agenda. The lead agenda has a thrust focus on areas that we as a HDC are best positioned to lead in advancing solutions to affordable housing. The support agenda has a lot of work that we're committed to, but it is work that will be led by our partners, and we will be lending our support and brand as a movement in supporting that work to move forward. Now, I do want to talk briefly about how we have broken our work into 3 pillars or 3 buckets. Number 1, we're committed to dramatically increasing resources for affordable housing. Many of you know this best, that really the money moves the ball on the crises that are overlapping around affordable housing. And in 2023, as you will be discussing today, we're talking about robustly increasing the Seattle Housing Levy with its next iteration. We're talking about supporting the Veterans, Seniors, and Human Services Levy renewal that's going to be happening across the region. We're also looking at the state level, supporting traditional areas of priority that we have supported, like the Housing Trust Fund, but alongside that, creating new revenue sources. And there is work that is underway in drafting a REIT bill that you will hear about at this summit today. We're also paying attention at the federal level, where we know that the leveraging power that we've had over the years from sources like LIHTC and others are to an extent diminishing or staying flat if there is no change. And we will be supporting partners who are doing that work at the federal level and keeping on our radar what is happening at the federal level. Now, the second pillar of our work is where we have coiled our land use advocacy, our zoning advocacy into a build and maintain inclusive communities. And this is where we have an opportunity as HDC to ensure that our comprehensive plans, which are North Stars for jurisdictions, have in their DNA housing affordability baked into it. We have the comprehensive plan updates that will be completed by 2024, and we're looking at jurisdictions across the region and ensuring that that commitment to affordability is really truly being underpinned in the process. There will not only be overall comprehensive plan updates, within that there is a housing element which we will really zero in on to drive advocacy of baking that DNA of affordability into comprehensive plans. There's a lot of other work around how do we acquire land proactively, how do we create inclusive communities overall, and you'll be hearing about other efforts around that during a panel today. We're also committed to the nexus of our work at the climate change, racial equity, and affordable housing intersection. And this was where the bucket around improving the health of residents, improving the stability of housing for people, and sustainability of housing as a sector in advancing a built environment that we know can be healthy is what we have in our third pillar and bucket. Now, let me say this, 2023, if you could stop sharing, JC, at this point, is a year to go big and bold for affordable housing solutions. This does not bear or need to be repeated for many of you because this is your work every day. But with the pace of growth that we've seen that has continued despite the pandemic, the population growth, the job growth, even the development, although we're underdeveloping affordable housing, rents have continued to skyrocket. Home prices have continued to skyrocket. And the supply of homes for people with low and modest incomes continue to really dwindle at this particular point. People with the lowest and modest incomes, critical workers in our community, elementary school teachers, grocery clerks, nurses are not able to afford to live in our region. And we know that communities of color are hit the hardest. You'll be looking at a number as Jesse walks us through data from across the region, that the cost burden number is 272,000 people were cost burdened. And when you look at the share of who is being disproportionately impacted, it is low-income households, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. And that is the challenge that is before all of us. We are fast losing economic and ethnic diversity as a community. But we, as HDC, have the power to change the situation. I will say that the silver line is that we're producing more housing than we've ever in the past years. And yet at the same time that we have been producing this housing, the need for housing has only gotten greater than ever. At the same time, it's more expensive to purchase land. It's more expensive to build. And we have limited resources to actually do that work. We have zoning policies that limit our ability to address the crisis effectively. And we've continued to see systemic inequities being laid bare before us. And we have a commitment as a collective to address that crisis from a systems change level. Jesse will be walking us through data that we've compiled to really give a sense of grounding of where we are as a region. I want us all to remember that behind all the numbers are real people, real families and communities. And I know all of you are committed to this work, knowing that housing is at the heart of making it possible for many families to actually thrive, for many communities to thrive, and for our environment to be sustainable. And as we continue in this journey towards fair and affordable housing in our communities, I just want to thank all of you for the work and commitments that you demonstrate every day on the front lines of our vision. And with that, I will be remiss to not thank the staff who have pulled this summit together. Jesse joining us just a month ago and really diving right in to drive this work. We're grateful to you, and we're grateful to the HDC team who supported you in this process. And I'll hand over to you to walk us through the data before we get into the sessions today.
Thank you, Patience. Yeah, great to see so many familiar faces on the screen. I'm the new Government Relations and Policy Manager at HDC, and I want to start us off by going through some of the grounding and data on current housing need in King County. First off, what is affordable housing? A lot of you are probably pretty familiar with this stuff now, but for those who don't work directly in housing on a day-to-day basis, I think it's important to get grounded. Basically, everything is built around area median income, or AMI. For a family of four in the Seattle area, King and Snohomish counties, that's now $134,000. HUD sets that number every year, and then all of the benchmarks on what is on development of low-income housing are based off of that number. So 30% of area median income is considered extremely low income, 30 to 50% is considered very low income, and 50 to 80% is low income. I have at the right some examples of people who might be earning in these wage brackets. So under 30% AMI, a senior on Social Security is unable to, is clearly within that bracket. Childcare workers, nursing assistants, food service workers all fall right in the very low income brackets. And then even more skilled like machinists, like welders, could be easily in the 50 to 80%. I say all this to emphasize that when we're talking about low income housing, affordable housing in King County, we're talking about people who are essential to the workings of our economy and our society. Now, the connection to cost burden is the other part of the definition of affordable housing. So you're considered cost burden if you're spending more than 30% of your income on rent on a gross basis. You're considered severely cost burdened if you're spending more than 50% of your income on rent. We know that people who are cost burdened, and especially severely cost burdened, mathematically, they just have less money to spend on everything else in life. They are so much closer to the economic cliff. If you're extremely low income and spending more than half of your income on rent, you're only one or two bad mistakes from losing your housing. A job loss, a medical emergency, or expensive car repair could be enough to push you into homelessness. So what does cost burden look like in King County as a whole? Well, overall, we have 272,000 households who are housing cost burdened, including almost 120,000 who are severely cost burdened. A bit more than half of those who are severely cost burdened are extremely low income. And then if you look at the moderate cost burdens, the 30 to 50% of income on rent, you see a broader range of incomes represented. What's happened in King County over the last 10 years is that we have seen a massive decrease in available and affordable homes for low-income people. A net loss of over 100,000 homes that are available and affordable for less than 80% AMI, as housing prices have increased and production has not kept up with demand. I'll note that this data is pretty old. The HUD, this is all based off of the HUD CHAZ data, which is great because it shows you how much people are spending on rent by income bracket, but it takes them 4 years to actually turn around any data. So anytime you hear data about less than 30%, anytime you hear detailed data about AMI brackets, you keep in mind that it's always going to be about 4 years old. And what we've seen is that over the course of time, the cost of housing in King County has continued to outpace incomes. We've seen median home prices more than double just in the last 8 years, and rent prices increased by 75%. We are dealing also with an environment in which construction costs continue to spiral out of control, more than 25% increase over the last 5 years, including more than 10% in just the last year. Corollary to this is how the federal low-income housing tax credit program is currently maxed out. And I'll circle back to just how important a resource that is for the development of affordable housing in King County and nationwide. And you'll hear this a bit later, but we've seen really major diminishment in the prospects for substantial new federal investments in housing. This is data that pulls together the total number of affordable units by income bracket for the last 10 years. You may notice it's a little bit different than the previous graph from McKinsey. showing actually a bit of a rise up through about 2015 in units affordable at the 30 to 50 and 50 to 80% AMI bracket. This is largely because of the phenomenon known as down renting, in which someone slightly higher income will be renting an apartment that is designated as affordable for a lower bracket. But anyways, the King County has put together an analysis of the projected need over the next 24 years as part of the comprehensive planning process. They project that to eliminate cost burden and accommodate projected growth over the next 20 years, we need to add 342,000 homes total, with the bulk of these actually being at less than 80% of area median income, including 136,000 at less than 30%. What this basically shows to me is that we need to bend back that diminishment in low-income homes and really start net adding affordable homes via funding and land use reform and regulatory reforms to accelerate the production of housing. I like to show this as an annual basis, though, because 342,000 homes sounds almost impossible to build. So breaking this down on a per year basis, we need to add over 8,800 homes per year affordable at less than 80% of area median income per the most recent Department of Commerce figures. Doing some like back of the napkin math on current capital costs of about 330,000 a year, and this sums to an annual capital cost of 2.9 billion. I'll note that these, this capital cost figure is very rough. It varies quite a bit by location within the region, with the east side being the most expensive, followed by Seattle, and then South King being least expensive. And what we're seeing is a continued escalation in the construction costs of homes. So what does that $2.9 billion look like against the total public funding of affordable housing in King County? Well, it shows we have a pretty big gap, both within Seattle and for the rest of King County. All in, we have about $1 billion in total public capital funding for affordable housing in King County for 2021. Nearly 2/3 of that comes in the form of low-income housing tax credits, the bulk of which are the 4% low-income housing tax credit that develops 50 and 60%, but housing affordable at 50 and 60% of area median income. Then we see that the city of Seattle is contributing about $150 million per year in affordable housing dollars from the Seattle Housing Levy, the Jumpstart payroll tax, and mandatory housing affordability payments. Arch, by contrast, is contributing about $5.7 million for affordable housing and constitutes the only local capital funding for affordable housing outside the city of Seattle. We can also see about $120 million in King County sources, including from the Health Through Housing initiative, the Veteran Seniors and Human Services Levy, TOD funds, etc. And then the state allocated a record $50 million in local capital funding for affordable housing. But overall, I mean, the takeaway is, as much as we're doing as a region to invest in affordable housing, we still see a massive gap against what we would really need to scale up affordable housing production to meet the needs and the projected needs, amounting to almost 600 million in Seattle and 1.3 billion for the rest of King County. Any questions here? Can field some from the chat. So how are we going to address these astounding needs that are only worsening by the year? Well, HDC's advocacy agenda, as Patience mentioned, fits into 3 buckets. First, funding of affordable homes. Second, building and maintaining inclusive communities. And third, improving the health, stability, and sustainability of housing. I'm going to run us through the lead agenda here by bullet point. As an emphasis, again, we also have a support agenda, which is emphasizing the places in which we stand in coalition. And the lead agenda, by contrast, is meant to encapsulate just those items on which we are dedicating significant staff time from the Housing Development Consortium. So for 2023, we have advocacy for a state bill to authorize a local option real estate excise tax for affordable housing. We have renew and expanding the Seattle housing levy. We have advocating for mandatory inclusionary zoning in Bellevue that leverages the commercial and residential growth they've seen, and leading the work to create a framework for sub-regional investments in the form of housing levies, creating the framework for that at the state level to set up future initiatives in terms of actually using that authority for a sub-regional levy. Any questions in the chat? All right. Second bucket, building and maintaining. Okay. Building and maintaining inclusive communities. This is our land use bucket. We have leading coalition work on the major update of Seattle's comprehensive plan, as well as shaping the housing elements across King County. We have advocacy for a statewide middle housing bill. And we have leading education coalition efforts on housing benefit districts to acquire land for affordable housing. And then built within all of this is partnering to support the Black Home Initiative policy framework that includes many of the same policy details as are in the rest of the advocacy agenda, but are a way of centering racial equity and affordable home ownership within each of the policy recommendations and providing a unique twist on that. Second part of—
Jesse?
Yes.
Just to chime in real quickly, there's a comment from Grace in the chat that I wanted to read. I think it's related to the first bucket. So Grace Kim mentioned the gap of funds we need to build affordable housing has widened over the last decade. The need continues to grow. This is a good reminder of the need for creative funding sources and need for partnerships with development partners who can build the 80 to 100% AMI housing to take some of the burden off affordable housing.
Yes, it's a good note. To me, it's a point about simultaneously scaling up funding as well as reforming land use to ensure that the market is not going to meet all of the needs, but it can meet more than it's currently meeting if we lift land use restrictions and gear them towards affordability. The second part of our building and maintaining inclusive communities advocacy agenda is about advocating for regulatory reform to accelerate housing production and reduce the cost of building housing. Got some examples in here. I'll point out that some elements are most applicable to Seattle, but there is also much that is applicable to jurisdictions across King County. We have broadly increasing allowed densities, heightened floor area ratios, We have facilitating efficient permitting and coordination. We also have advancing waivers for utility fees, as well as infrastructure improvement fees, exempting affordable housing and housing more broadly from parking requirements. And then the one piece that is solely Seattle focused is eliminating design review for affordable homes. In our final bucket for the lead agenda, improving health, stability, and sustainability. We have advocacy for public funding of resident services in non-permanent supportive housing. We have advocacy for increased funding for rental assistance at the state level and supporting funding of housing counselors to prevent foreclosures and assist first-time homebuyers. That takes us to the end of this part of the program. We have actually a bit of time here before the first panel is set to start. So have some time for questions if folks have them. First panel on transformative investments in affordable housing, really focused on the funding piece, is going to come at 10:15.
Jesse, this is Katie Randall with Plymouth Housing. Follow-up / clarifying question. Did you say there's also a shortage of homes affordable and available above 80% AMI? In other words, a shortage across all income brackets? Or are we dealing with more of a regional mismatch where there is an excess of homes affordable and available above 80%, but too few below 80%?
Well, what you can see from the data is that there are cost burdens even above 80% AMI. They're far from as severe as those below 80%, but yes, we have, it's not merely a mismatch regionally, it is a net shortage of affordable, of homes broadly and affordable homes specifically.
Thank you.
Jesse, this is Dennis, also Plymouth Housing. But one thing I wanted to highlight for everyone that I think is also really important to understand this year is that the updated HUD AMI numbers now are $134,000, which previously I think was 106 or roughly that amount. And so that increase is so dramatic that it really changes the outlook for kind of that cost burden that you're talking about for so many families across the region, and especially with the housing market going the way that it has. It's harder and harder for individuals who are making regular salaries to be able to afford housing. I have family friends that one of them is a teacher, another is a nurse at Seattle Children's, and I know that they would squarely fall in the very cost burden area for affordable housing.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thanks, Dennis. Yeah, and again, to emphasize that all of our cost burden figures are basically 4 to 8 years old. They're very backward looking, and they don't cover the absolutely insane increase in housing prices that we've seen since the start of the pandemic. Well, if there's no other questions, I guess we could do a little preview of what our first panel is about.
Sure, I'm happy to walk through that. We have some great panelists today, very thrilled with all the expertise, and thank you for all the panelists for joining us today. We're going to be looking at transformative investments for affordable housing. And so we'll start off with a conversation about the Seattle Housing Levy renewal. and I'll introduce the individual panelists as we move through the program. But both of the two panelists are on the task force for HDC. They're the co-chairs of the HDC task force on levy renewal. So we're very grateful to have them participating and discussing what the task force will be focusing on. We'll then move to more presentation style remarks from a number of different individuals. The first will be on the King County Veterans, Seniors, and Human Services Levy Renewal. The next will be on the state's real estate excise tax exemption bill, the REIT, and then we will focus on the federal funding for affordable housing. So this panel is designed to kind of look at all of the different tools that we, and both on the PAG, but also HDC, as well as many of the member organizations are pursuing to hopefully boost our investment and creativity in delivering affordable housing. Patience, do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, great work, Dennis. I'm excited about the panel and looking forward to hearing more from all of the speakers. I will emphasize that the Seattle Housing Levy speakers are both the co-chairs of the HDC Levy Task Force. So I will hand over to you and the panelists.
Thanks. Let me see. I'm not sure if we're ready to start a few minutes early, but Susan and Doug, if you're both available and ready, maybe we can start 5 minutes early and start on some questions. So I will start with the introductions. So as I mentioned before, Susan Boyd is the CEO of Bellwether Housing. She's one of the co-chairs of the Seattle Housing Levy Renewal effort on behalf of HDC. So we're very grateful for that. And Doug Ito is with SMR Architects and also is a co-chair of that effort. So we're very grateful. I think that participating through HDC, working with the task force is immensely important for organizations like mine, Plymouth Housing, which depends greatly on the levy to deliver a lot of our projects. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to have this conversation. And if Susan or Doug would like to say anything at the beginning before we get into questions, please do. And then we can go into some of the questions that we've prepared. Also, for anyone who's interested in asking questions, please include them in the chat, and then we'll try and get to them at the end of their prepared questions. Susan or Doug, do you have anything you'd like to say before we start? Okay.
No, Dennis, I think we can work it all into to the questions that you have for us.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. Thank you both for taking the time. Thanks for taking this leadership effort. I know that it's essentially a 2-year process just to do all the work that's needed to get it on the ballot and to get it ready for passage. So we're grateful for all of your work. The first question is, what is the Seattle Housing Levy?
So, hi, Dennis, thank you so much. And Doug and I will kind of navigate between ourselves to fully answer questions. So Doug, feel free to amend or append to my responses. So I want to ground us a little bit in the levy and what it is for us. First of all, the role of HDC in moving the levy forward each time it has gone forward has been critical. So I'm grateful to see all of you here. So the levy is essentially a property tax. It has been around. Seattle voters first approved of, it was actually a bond measure in 1981, and then for senior housing, and then by 1986 we passed the first of what has been now 5 levies. We started at about 50 million and over, I can't remember if it was 5 or 7 years. And the current levy is about $290 million over 7 years. And we're in the last, next year will be the last year of that levy. So next year we will be putting a measure in front of the voters to approve hopefully the sixth levy. The levy pays for primarily its biggest chunk goes towards capital production of new housing and acquiring housing off the market to bring in, so creating new permanently affordable housing. It's also used to make sure that we can take care of our existing stock of affordable housing, so paying for major capital repairs and improvements. We use it to fund, many of our organizations use it to support services and just ongoing operations where the rents that are collected are insufficient to really just even operate buildings. There is a home ownership portion of the levy. It's the kind of critical portion of critical subsidy for our home ownership programs. And then there's a bit of the levy that goes towards homeless prevention services and housing stability. That's been the scope of the levy for a while, and it is similar to, I think, how I don't imagine that scope changing a whole lot. I think the only other thing I just want to reiterate the importance of the levy it has been, although it is not always or even ever the biggest source of funding in a particular project, it is absolutely foundational. It is the source that must come in. You know, there's been so much federal disinvestment in housing. Other sources have been very limited. So when we cobble together all sources, it is really the housing levy that has been absolutely dependable and allows us to really leverage all of those other sources. So it is absolutely essential to the success of our community in creating new housing.
And
notwithstanding some of Jesse's dire.
And although it is, I mean, like Susan says, it is critical and foundational. And although we need affordable housing throughout the state because it's a crisis throughout the state, the levy does allow Seattle to be much more competitive in any funding round. So it is important for the city of Seattle to have the levy in place so that we can get more housing here, where it is probably the most critical in the state.
Well, thank you both very much for that introduction to the levy. And also thank you for pointing out the importance of leverage and what that means as we're, as a region competing for housing funding from other sources as well. So very grateful for that. I want to move on next to the second question, which is what are your priorities for the housing levy renewal? And I'll add one thing that I'd also be really interested, not just from your perspective as working with HDC on this as co-chairs, but also within both of your individual organizations. I think it'd be great to kind of highlight anything in terms of your priorities and what the levy means both to Bellwether and to SMR. But thank you very much, and I'll let you answer a question.
So I think it's fairly obvious the main priority is under uses and then the need for capital to do those things within the city. We need obviously to build more rental housing. I mean, as Jesse pointed out, there's a huge lack of it, and the cost burden people of the city need affordable housing. There's just all across the board. It's an issue for homeless as well as for workforce and middle income people. So it is a huge issue. We need to provide that capital for the rental housing market as well as the home ownership program that Susan mentioned. We would like that to be more robust as well. We need to have that capital so the city is able to take on opportunities where they are in the city for to acquire things off market, either as acquisition or property for affordable housing in the future. We also desperately need the money for aging portfolio within the city of Seattle. There are a number of projects that need updating after 30 years or more in the affordable housing portfolio. A number of them are URMs that are, or unreinforced masonry units, which will need to be seismically upgraded at some point in time. You know, buildings don't last forever, and they do need to be rehabilitated after their useful life. So it's extremely important to have that money. And it's also needed for the services and operations dollars that are needed to keep these buildings running.
Well, I want to stress the scale of the levy. I think HDC needs to be, and our community in general needs to be really bold in how we approach this next levy. I mean, I'm not going to repeat the statistics that Jesse just laid out for you, but we have, despite all the great work that the HDC members are doing, we're sort of filling a bucket with a big hole in the bottom of it. And we are, as I mentioned, and I know HDC has done presentations on the declining availability of federal housing resources with compared to need. And we've, you know, there's a little, we had some hope that there would be more federal investment in housing. There has been a little, but not nearly what we need in this last legislative session. And honestly, the state is just barely kind of back to pre-2008 or pre-Great Recession numbers. So it really is the city that we need to be bold to set an example for other levels of government, and honestly other jurisdictions around state. So we've got incredible inflation in costs, just 25% or more since the last levy. Much of that in the last couple of years, and likely to see more in the next couple of years. And I will say that previous levies have been sized, assuming that just about all of the levy money for production is being leveraged with the federal low-income housing tax credit and other resources. And if those are not keeping up with increased need for production, and so it will be the levy that probably has to independently fund, start independently funding projects that aren't able to get those other resources. So for all of those reasons, and the need for Dennis to go to your point of something particular to Bellwether. I mean, we have increased our production. We need resources to be able to continue that increased pace of production. I know Plymouth has done the same thing. And one thing and the need for services is increasing, and it is a funding source that needs, we need it every year. It's not like with production money, you spend it once and you've got a building, and then you've got to take care of not just the buildings, but the people inside the buildings. And we are just seeing increasing need for support in not just in, we know that about permanent supportive housing. That has always been true. We have not ever fully funded it. I know Plymouth does a lot of fundraising to supplement the need for services. And organizations like Bellwether that are, kind of affordable housing and not necessarily permanent supportive housing providers have tenants with increasing needs. Mental health issues abound in our buildings, and we are not supported with service dollars. And so our tenants struggle. We struggle to take care of them. And I know that we have been pleading for more public support of our resident services programs. And I think that'll be an added component in the next levy round. So all of that is just to say, we need to be big and bold with this next levy. We're talking about something that is many times more, 3-4 times more than the current levy.
I think we are prioritizing and looking to do a number that is substantial and will hopefully, as you see from what we both explained, the need is so huge that we need to push for the biggest levy that we can get at this time.
Thank you.
All the money is needed.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for that. I think, we're definitely grateful for your leadership in searching for increasing, that pot of funding and really taking a hard look at, what we need to ask from a bold perspective. I think the research shows, from McKinsey study, and, I know there was a book recently from a University of Washington professor about, the actual need in terms of funding that housing stock. And so I think, that certainly that investment is greatly needed. And I also really appreciate you bringing up the, preserving our existing housing stock. I think, one of the things that we at Plymouth are really interested in is preservation and renovation, because there aren't an adequate number of sources to support that at the state level or at the federal level. And so the levy is hugely important for that. So thank you for sharing that. We'll move on to the next question, which is, where are we in the housing level renewal process? And what is the role of the HDC task force?
So we're very early in the levy renewal process. The Office of Housing has begun engaging various stakeholders. I suspect many of you out there have been in some of those meetings where they have heard, I think, a lot of providers and other community members talk about what they see as the needs. And I know that they'll continue that. They have engaged a technical advisory committee to analyze various options for the levy. I know the OH is doing a lot of math in the background right now to kind of assess, if the levy were at this rate, then we, with assumptions about inflation and leverage and all of that, how much housing would it produce and various options. They will present that and have that kind of refine that with the help of a technical advisory committee of various folks in the housing world and in our community, and then present a few options to the mayor's office. HDC will help support is raising money to support a poll this year that will go out in September to kind of test the temperature out there and the appetite among the public for levy messaging, levy scale, and that will help inform the mayor's decision about what to propose. And then by the end of the year or early next year, the mayor will have decided on his recommended levy scope and scale. Next year, so there's no official campaign until next year. And as I mentioned earlier, HDC is a critical part of that campaign. We want to make sure that you all are participating. There'll be lots for you to do next year in supporting the levy. But starting early, the mayor will likely submit a proposal to council in February. And then there'll be some more polling to further assess support and messaging. Council will decide when the levy will be placed on the ballot, whether that will be August or November. Likely November, and that is what we're supporting, is a November ballot placement. And then we will vote in November and celebrate the day after. That's a kind of an outline of the process. The task force job, I think I'll let Doug talk a little bit about the specific role of the task force and HDC members in particular.
So as Susan mentioned, there's sort of like two prongs to this. There's the official campaign that will get started for that needs to get started eventually, and that will be the official voting, election, all that needs to go on. However, HDC is critical and important to support that work. So one of the things we'll want you who have come to this meeting and others who participate a lot in HDC is build enthusiasm and excitement around the levy, not just with yourself, but we want you to expand that within your organization, the people you work with, friends, even enemies who may not want the levy, to try to bring them on board. We want the biggest levy possible, and we want as many votes as possible to make sure that this gets passed in a huge way. It has been in the past, and we'd like to have that happen again. So we want you to educate and build enthusiasm throughout organizations, friends, relatives, anyone you know who can vote in Seattle. We want support from our stakeholders, key stakeholders, who are probably aligned, but not HDC members necessarily. So DSA, which is the Downtown Seattle Association, the Chamber, businesses throughout Seattle, to make sure they're on board with the levy. And if you have any connections to them, it would be great. We want you to be ambassadors to the community to make sure that we get our message out, that the message is one that resonates with people, and that we get this levy passed. I think one of the other things that is important to support HDC is if you have any connections to people within the city, the mayor's office, council, etc., to help patients and HDC with those connections would be great. And eventually when the campaign does start, there are going to be opportunities to raise signs, get out the vote, calls to citizens to make sure they go and vote for the levy, etc. So there's lots to do in the future, but now people can start talking about the levy and getting people interested and excited about it. It does happen every 7 years, so a lot of people have moved to the city and have no idea how funding gets appropriated or doled out for affordable housing. There are a lot of people who forget in the last 7 years, so they need to be reminded. So it's very important that we get the message out.
Can I mention one other thing? And so I think it's budget season for many of our member organizations. It is for us. One thing that I ask all HDC members here, go back and make sure that you have put in your budget some amount of financial support for the campaign next year. Campaigns take money, and we will be looking at, can't stress enough the importance of HDC members in getting this levy passed. And while we have had great support passed by huge margins, the art is creating a size of levy that is big, bold, aggressive, that still gets support. I mean, I think actually in the perfect world, you pass it by 51% because you've gone so big that not everybody is sure they want to go that big. But
enough to pass it.
We have to pass it. We have to pass it. But it isn't. So it is an art to get to that right number. And when you are going to be big and bold, it does take resources to for the campaign to convince voters or educate voters about the need. We'll have Jesse out doing that pitch about the need once a week, and we got to pay his salary.
There are many other expenses go along with a campaign. So that money is needed, as Susan says, from organizations, and or if you'd like to donate personally as well, that's fine too. But it is an expensive proposition to do, but the benefit for the people who need the housing is so huge that we need to do it.
I will say that Bellwether is putting $10,000 into its budget next year, and I'll just put a number out there for you all to shoot for.
Thanks so much for that. So real quickly, just wanted to do a quick time check with Jesse. We've got 2 more questions prepared. I also wanted to remind folks to, if you have any questions for this panel, include them in the chat. I saw that Dean posted a question about slides, and Jesse said that we will be sharing the slides after this event. So thank you. How are we doing on time, Jesse?
We're a little over. I think there's the question about the comparison to MHA and Jumpstart's worth answering though.
So Dennis, I can kind of state the question. And so I know that we do get a lot of questions, and I anticipate that you will get a lot of questions about why do we need the levy? We've now got mandatory housing affordability fees going into funding housing, and we've got Jumpstart going into housing. And if you recall, just to put those on the map a little bit, Jumpstart is a tax on highly compensated employees within the city of Seattle, not on the corporations that employ them. And MHA is, so there was a big upzone, and so all developers developing in Seattle now either have to put restrict some of their units to be affordable or pay a fee in lieu of doing that. Over the past, so just some numbers, $50 million came out of MHA in 2021. The Jumpstart is, let's see, I think we collected $234 million in 2021, but a bunch of that was swept out to cover holes in the budget for that resulted from the pandemic. So 71 million came into housing. So those numbers though, so those are big numbers, and that's great. And as Jesse pointed out, we need all of it. And those MHA numbers and the Jumpstart numbers are really vulnerable to shifts in in the economy, and developer decisions about whether to pay fees in lieu or to include the housing in their projects. They do not displace the need for a very bold levy. And I want to make sure and provide you all some talking points, because I think you're going to get asked that question. And because I know we've been asked it already.
And those funds do allow the city to have some flexibility when things like COVID happens and there are gaps in budget, or interest rates go skyrocketing and there's gaps in budget. So that does allow Office of Housing to do some stuff that may not be in their budget, but they have this money that they can use.
Doug and Susan, thank you very much for this panel and for a great discussion on the levy. I'm going to hand it to Patience. She has one comment about the levy. There's also a question in the chat related to the social housing initiative and its relation to levy. I'm not sure if either of the panelists after Patience speaks can address that. If not, we can follow up with Daryl, who asked the question later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis, and thank you, Doug and Susan, for outlining the work ahead of us. I do want to underscore the things you said, in particular when we're thinking about the scale and size of the levy as we renew. Because while we can talk about Jumpstart funding, we can talk about MHA funding, the Seattle Housing Levy has been the heart and soul of investing in affordable housing in the city. It's been the foundational sort of door funding that gets affordable housing projects started, and that has to be emphasized in our messaging. It has to be reiterated across the board that while we've done well in creating new revenue sources, in attracting investments from Amazon and Microsoft and other philanthropic partners, we still are in a place where the need for housing has just been exacerbated up against the reality of economic trends, where the cost of construction just continues to skyrocket, from material to produce housing, that's inclusive of lumber, steel, glass, etc., labor costs, that all has gone up. So in order for us to get to a point where the outcomes that we expect from a levy can really be meaningful, the level of investment in the levy has to be most robust. And we'll continue to shape what that looks like. It will take all of you, as the coaches outlined, investing resources in the campaign, showing up to reiterate the messaging, talking about the history of the levy. We have so many new people who have moved to our region who need to know how far we've come. The last time the levy was run, we passed it by 70% voter support. And we believe we can keep that generous streak. And the time to be able to prepare to do so is now, to really educate people within your own organizations, within your own communities and constituencies, in order for us to be able to run effectively a robust campaign next year. Other pieces that I wanted to draw from what you spoke about in terms of the programs certainly need more investments in the capital dollars. I do want to underscore the other need around operations, maintenance, and services. We have about 25 buildings in the city that are set to have a funding cliff, because we've seen a decline in funding sources for operations and services at the federal level and other sources that we've had in the past. And we need to increase those investments for operations and services with the next levy. And we can only be able to do that when we really take cognizance on the ground of who are some of the people who are doing this work, because we can't do the work of operating and providing services to the community without the workforce who are doing the work on the ground. So that's going to be the other aspect. The other layer that I appreciated that you elevated is the home ownership aspect, where we do have an opportunity to really commit to our equity goals of repairing homes by investing in all of those programs. And the only way we can invest in the programs is if the size of the levy is meaningful. And I'll continue to reiterate that, because that is a message that is important as the city is shaping the policy options now to get to a model that will be supported by the voters. Well, with that, Dennis, I'll hand back over to you for the next session.
Thank you very much. And we'll make sure to follow up with Daryl on his question related to the social housing initiative. But thank you, and we'll move on. Thank you, Susan, Doug. We'll move on now to the King County Veterans, Seniors, and Human Services Levy renewal discussion and presentation. I believe Jesse will be providing some of the visual aids for it, but Leon Richardson and Jacqueline Monahan with King County will be talking about that levy renewal process. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. So I have a slide deck that I'll try and do my best to share here momentarily, but just to introduce myself, my name is Leon Richardson. I'm the Division Director of Adult Services within the Department of Community and Human Services. And my division has the privilege of stewarding the Veterans, Seniors, and Human Services Levy. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to Jackie.
Thanks, Leon. Hi, everyone. Jackie Moynihan. I'm the Interim Division Director for the Housing, Homelessness, and Community Development Division. And here with Leon, as there are dollars that are in the levy that our division deploys, particularly focused on both the capital and services funding from the levy. It's good to be with you all. Back to you, Leon.
Thanks. So I have about 10 slides that I'll run through, giving an overview of just the Veterans, Seniors, and Human Services Levy and some of our funding in the housing stability realm and what the future planning looks like. And then we'll get through that relatively quick, and then we'll open it up for questions from the group. And Jackie and I will do our best to tag team those and be responsive to any questions you have about the levy and how it shows up in the community. So bear with me for one moment. Can folks see that okay?
Yep.
Yes, we
Cool.
can.
So the Veterans, Seniors, and Human Services Levy is currently in its third iteration. This slide illustrates how it passed in the last two iterations. It passed at a 68% rate both times. So going into 2023, we will be looking to get the VSHSL renewal on the ballot. And this will be the fourth iteration of this levy. Just an overview of this iteration of the levy: 6-year voter approved property tax. You see the funding amounts there. The pivot in this iteration of the levy was including the seniors populations as a part of the levy. Historically, it had just been Veterans Human Services Levy, and in this iteration of it, it expanded to be the Veterans, Seniors, and Human Services Levy. In this iteration, it also took a pivot to have 5 result areas, and in the next slide, we'll go over what those result areas are. And just as an overarching principle for the levy, we ask the question, what can only the levy, the VSHSL do? And that is a hint at, we fully recognize that there's a complete system, whether it's looking at what's happening in the nonprofit sector, the philanthropic areas, as well as with, local, county, state, federal. And one of the unique things about the VSHSL is it tries to be the gap fillers in between the system to make sure that we're having a truly connected system holistically and being intentionally duplicative where there's a need to go deeper in a particular area, having the flexibility to do so. And so you really see what I was just describing show up. And that's what kind of the gears in the upper right-hand corner represent, is how do we all work together as a system? and that's the uniqueness that the VSHSL brings. You see in the lower right, veteran seniors and resilient communities, which shows up for us in our implementation plan as vulnerable populations, and we made the pivot to resilient communities to take a more strength-based approach. And the important thing to call out for you all is that 25% roughly of the totality of our funding goes towards housing stability related things. Just from a planning perspective, so going through the spring and the summer, we did a lot of community engagement. We did a lot of focus groups with partners, and I believe we're going to try and get some meetings on the calendars with various subgroups of the HDC to have those conversations as well, to inform what does the next iteration of the Veteran Seniors and Human Services Levy look like. If I could just say like ditto to everything that the city of Seattle said in terms of like the ask and like what our plans are, we're pretty much in lockstep. So you heard from the city of Seattle that they're considering an August or November ballot. We are in the same, whereas the city of Seattle is currently leaning towards a November ballot, we are currently leaning towards, from a recommendation standpoint, an August ballot. And just want to add the caveat that none of those decisions have been made yet. These are recommendations that are in the process of flowing up through division and departmental levels to our elected leaders within the county to formally make those decisions, which I'm going to speculate a little bit here and say that I think those decisions will come towards the end of this year, beginning of next year, of when that shows up with our hard line of, I think, needing to get a formal decision made on when it shows up on a ballot, I think in the January, February timeframe. So our housing stability strategies, here's what they are. I just threw them up on a slide so that people could take a look at them. The biggest strategy we have is that first bullet. That is roughly a $60 million strategy over the life of the levy. And that captures our operating dollars as well as our capital investment. We have some other areas within here that there's some capital dollars as well, but the bulk of it lives right here. Throughout the totality of these strategies, from the initial investment from the VSHSL, it is over $115 million investment through the life of the levy. Here's some of the capital funded housing investments that the VSHSL contributed to. So just wanted to throw those up because feedback we often get is like, people don't realize all the different areas that VSHSL dollars touch within the county. And so I know there's probably a lot of partners that are on this call as well. And so wanted to just highlight where that shows up. I'll pause here for a second so people can like take a glance. The next slide is, although these are like housing stability strategies where our capital investments are showing up, we do have with a lot of our partners that are in other strategies doing innovative things that directly connect to housing stability, getting people housed in that respect. One of the ways that that shows up with, I think, a lot of our contracted partners that are providing direct services through our flexible financial assistance, they are providing a lot of assistance to do things to keep people housed. And that's like rental assistance, utility assistance, things of that nature, move-in assistance to get people first month's rent, things of like that nature to make sure that we're either keeping people housed or doing things to get them housed. An example of what we've done in the veteran sector is a pilot that's called collaborative case management. This is a pilot that we worked on with King County Housing Authority, with the federal VA to take underutilized HUD-VASH vouchers and have the case management provided for those vouchers through King County. And we've seen extreme success through that pilot program. And here's some of the 1-year results that we saw. And like to date, we have like 4 vouchers left, and we're working with the VA to get more because we've fully exhausted all of the vouchers that were initially provided to us. And so I share that to say, like, innovation is one of the things that I think is very unique and empowering, impactful about the levy. Is it's flexible and nimble to be responsive, very responsive to our community's needs. And so as we are doing our community engagement, one of the things that I am looking to do is to hear from you all and others around what are the things that we can do to make sure that the next iteration of the BSHSL is more responsive to communities' needs than the one we have today. With that, here's some things that we're going to continue to meet with community. Here's some of our social media things where people can go to try and stay connected with what we're doing. I blew through that really quick with the goal of getting to what questions do you all have for Jackie and I, so we can have that conversation. And so I will go ahead and stop sharing, and we can open it up.
Thanks so much, Leon. That was a great presentation. Plymouth is a partner with several projects on your list, so we're grateful for the levy and happy to be a partner of yours. Just want to encourage anyone to add questions to the chat so that we can have Jackie and Leon address them.
I'll also note that we're dedicating time to the next policy advisory group to really dig into the specific policy details around the Veteran Seniors Human Services Levy. We are running a bit short on time, so unless there's a pressing question, I'd like to move us on to the Reits discussion.
Okay. Well, Leon, thank you. I think we'll go into more detail, as Jesse mentioned, in our future meeting. Also, there's a message in the chat for an invitation for you to join a group that Kathleen's putting together. So encourage you to do that as well. We'll move on. Thank you very much again, both Jackie and Leon. We'll move on to the next section of this panel, which is to talk about the state REIT bill. HDC's 2023 REIT bill, dedicated revenue for affordable housing. We will invite both Andrew Calkins with King County Housing Authority and Lindsay Masters with Arch to lead the discussion presentation. Thank you both for joining.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew and Lindsay. Framing this also as a bit of a conversation. Andrew, what is REIT, the real estate excise tax?
What a great question, Jesse. Thanks for having me. So the real estate excise tax is a charge that is assessed when most real estate changes hands between two parties. In some states, it's called a real estate transfer tax. Here we call it REIT. There is a portion of the REIT in most areas that is assessed at the local level, and then there's a larger real estate excise tax that is charged by the state, and the funds go to the state. At the local level, there's two main local options for 1/4% local real estate excise taxes that mostly cities can implement. And these are mostly used to fund kind of capital projects, your highways, streets, sidewalks, parks, things like that, projects that are included in a city's capital plan. And there is some flexibility in the second 1/4% REIT to fund affordable housing projects, but That's a temporary change that'd only be possible to access for the next 4 years. And then I think it's also, there's a lot of competition for those REIT funds already for the projects on the capital side.
So I've heard there's been some changes recently at the state level with REIT. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah. So in 2020, the state transitioned from a flat REIT assessment of 1.28% on the purchase price of a property, and they changed it to a graduated REIT structure. It's more progressive. So the larger the sale price, the higher the REIT assessment. So for properties where the sale is less than $500,000, it's 1.1%. It all goes, there's about 4 tiers. If the sale's over 3% or over $3 million, there's a 3% charge. And then of course there are the local rates on top of it. So you could actually have the highest REIT in King County is 3.5% on those larger apartment, typically apartment or commercial type transactions. And then folks probably have heard a lot about the Reit Exemption the last couple of years. Last year, the legislature passed an exemption for from the REIT on transfers of property that go to a nonprofit or public entity that'll be used for affordable housing. So thanks to all the folks on this call who supported that last year. That change will be effective beginning of 2023.
So HDC has been doing some work to develop legislation that can actually fund affordable housing using REIT. Can you talk about what that entails?
Yeah, so we think the REIT is a good tool to use to fund additional affordable housing, and HDC's created a kind of a small work group of folks who are looking at some potential state legislation and working with a Representative Chop on to get some input and guidance on how to do that. There's 2 sides to kind of what we're looking at. The first is creating another local option for cities or counties to establish a local REIT exclusively for affordable housing. To give you a sense of the scale of what this could do in King County, if we had just a 0.25% REIT for the entire county, say all cities adopted it, that would raise over $100 million for affordable housing each year. So it's not a small tool. It can produce a fairly significant amount of money. We're looking at the possibility of just doing kind of a simple 0.25% REIT or something like that, and also whether it makes sense to allow local cities to do a more graduated rate structure, kind of similar to what there is at the state, so that you could capture a little bit more revenue from those large transactions. The other piece we're looking at is whether there's a way to adjust the graduated REIT structure at the state level, really at the high end, to fund affordable housing at the state level as well. So we're still kind of running the numbers on that and what some of those graduated REIT changes would look like and how much revenue they produce. But overall, this would be a pretty flexible pool of money. Is kind of how we're thinking about it, going up to 80% of AMI for home ownership and 60% for rental properties is kind of what we're thinking. And then at the local level, really want to make sure there is possibilities for jurisdictions like in East King County or South King County to pool their money together to fund affordable housing projects.
So speaking of the local options and the need for funding at like the local jurisdictional level, Lindsay, could you talk about why it's important that we create tools like this for cities to use for affordable housing? Like, where might this tool be useful?
Yeah, it's going to be useful everywhere. So the idea is any city can opt into it. There's also some thought about allowing the county to opt in if a city doesn't opt in, so that even parts of the county that don't necessarily want to adopt a tax. They'll still end up contributing one way or the other. We don't have a levy outside Seattle. I think everybody knows that. And I think we know there's no realistic chance of getting a housing levy anytime soon outside Seattle, short of, you know, the small portion of the VETS levy that can help. So this is really important. Over Arch's history, we've been funding projects for 3 decades now. We can only come up with so much general fund dollars out of a city budget that can go towards housing. Arguably, we maybe could contribute more. Some cities could contribute more, but it's never going to get to the scale of investment that we need to make a big impact. And I think the REIT is probably our best shot at getting something like that in place so that there are greater investments going into housing other than in just concentrated in Seattle. I think the other thing is the county has done a great job of getting some funding sources stood up, but there's always, you know, some tension between how cities want projects to be developed and sponsored, and I think having a local revenue tool is a way to encourage cities to get more proactive about actually supporting affordable housing, rather than just kind of being in the back seat and you know, not necessarily coming out in support of projects that we want to see happen. So I think there's a lot of benefits. There's not another good option that we are seeing right now for a revenue tool that local jurisdictions would support at the state level besides the REIT. So we're putting high hopes on this, and we'll see where it goes.
So what are the political barriers that you see to adopting a REIT at the state level?
Yeah, it's probably for both of us, but obviously the realtors, they tend to have more influence than anyone would expect that they're going to have, and it's kind of surprising when you see it happen. And then I think commercial property owners and their representatives are going to be a significant issue this time around, particularly if there is a higher tier added for those, a higher rate added for the high-end properties. I think that's gonna create a stronger opposition this time around.
Yeah,
feel free to add on.
Yeah, I agree. I think the realtors associations will be the biggest obstacle. And I also think if we look at, you know, doing something with the REIT at the state level, affordable housing isn't the only area that's, you know, looking for additional revenue. So that is an obstacle as well. But I do think there's a nexus there with the REIT and affordable housing funding. Yeah, I do think it's interesting I think we have learned a little bit from when the state transitioned to the graduated REIT structure and property sales didn't really dip or anything like that. So I think there's some good messaging we can develop to push back on some of the inevitable opposition here.
What I do hope is that at least as jurisdictions, we can come out largely in support of this, and Arch is working on that, hoping the county will also come in strong support so there's more of a united front than there has been with past revenue bills. But I think, you know, having just spent a lot of time talking to elected officials about revenue tools, you can already kind of know what the message and some of the challenging messages are going to be, and particularly with the budget surplus at the state level. Why are we adding a new tax? Why are we just going to taxes to solve the issue? Aren't there other strategies that are more important regarding the supply of housing and other things cities should be doing on housing front? So there's a lot of kind of directions from which I'm expecting those points to come from, and we'll do our best to be prepared for those, and this is the time. Right now is the time to get prepared.
So how can HDC members interested get involved in supporting advocacy for a local option REIT? and or expanded REIT for housing at the state level?
Go ahead, Andrew.
It's a good question. I would say you can get involved with our powerful work group we have, about 7 or 8 folks. I think making sure you're getting looped into the Policy Advisory Committee or group, PAG, and getting updates as we get closer to session.
Thanks, Andrew and Lindsay. Any questions in the chat? Oh, got one from Andy. Similar to increasing REIT, is it possible to increase the lodging tax at the local or county level? More than 1/3 of the current lodging tax revenues go to affordable housing in King County, but Washington has one of the lower rates, and not all municipalities levy the full rate. Patience, I wonder if you want to take a stab at this. There.
Thank you, Jesse. I think, Andy, that is a great idea with looking further into and doing some extensive research on what's possible. I mean, we just made changes through House Bill 1090 this past session to allow use of some of the lodging tax dollars for housing at 0 to 30% AMI. So happy to follow up with you and have you participate in the policy advisory group.
All right, let's turn it over to Barbara from Up for Growth, who's going to present about the prospects for federal funding for affordable housing.
Thank you, Jesse. Okay, perfect. So first, I would like to thank the Housing Development Consortium of Seattle, King County, for inviting me and Up for Growth Action to participate on this panel. The Housing Development Consortium has been doing incredible work, and we are really proud to be partners, not only with your organization on many critical pieces of housing production legislation, but writ large. So today my focus, as Jesse said, is going to focus on the current prospects for federal reforms to increase housing production, particularly the possibility of LIHTC reform and a year-end tax bill. You know, I think we all here know how vital and important the housing credit is. It's housed over 8 million people. It's supported over 6 million jobs. It's generated hundreds of billions of dollars in wages and tax revenue. And we at Up for Growth, along with our members like HDC, have been beating the drum on this critically importance of this tax credit to creating and preserving affordable rental housing. And just by way of background, the last slide that we had up, you know, Up for Growth Action is a mission-driven federal advocacy organization. We believe housing is always an opportunity, never an obstacle. And so we're laser focused on exposing and tearing down 100 years of state and local exclusionary housing and land use policies that we believe has created this complex web of discriminatory system, laws, and regulations that make housing needlessly restrictive and prohibitively expensive. We all know that the nation's housing crisis is well beyond boundaries of major cities, and it's extended well into the suburbs and rural America. The cost of housing and demand for it is grossly outpacing salary and supply. Up for Growth's 2022 Housing Under Production in the US report found that the US is 3.8 million homes short of meeting our housing needs. That's double the number from 2012. And as a result, home ownership among young people are at an all-time low. Homelessness is on the rise. Families are paying skyrocket prices for homes and considerably more in rent. And so you think, can this American dream actually be realized? The low-income housing tax credit, as I said previously, is going to be the primary tool to create and preserve the affordable and rental housing that we need in addressing the severe housing affordability crisis. And so while Up for Growth's housing, next slide, sorry, Jesse. While Up for Growth's housing under production report numbers seem a little dire, there are bright spots. Housing has elevated as an issue. Now more than ever, federal policymakers are talking about housing and wanting to address it. And there's clear interest. You can see it both from the Biden administration and congressional Democrats. It's reflected in the president's housing supply action plan, in his FY23 budget proposal that included $10 billion for the housing credit. You can see it in the Department of Treasury's recent updated guidance, and that provides new flexibility for American Rescue Plan state and local fiscal recovery funds to be used to boost the supply of affordable housing. And nowhere is that even more reflected than in what is the now defunct Build Back Better plan. Obviously, I won't belabor the points. We all know it had over $150 billion in housing investment, 16.5 of that being for housing supply related provisions that included lowering the bond financing threshold, increasing the annual housing credit allocation, providing permanent 50% basis boost for properties serving ELIs, providing a permanent 3 basis boost for properties in Indian areas, as well as creating a new competitive HUD planning grant program, the Unlocking Possibilities program that would have provided $4.5 billion to state and cities across the country who are looking to implement plans to eliminate barriers and spur housing production. Unfortunately, this is politics, this is DC. And so a much smaller agreed upon reconciliation package was passed by the Senate Monday. The Inflation Reduction Act excluded nearly all of the housing provisions from BBB, with a few exceptions that you see here. You can go to the next slide. And so where does that leave us in terms of passing a housing supply package or other housing provisions? The answer is a little complicated. So we have an election year, and given the fact that it is an election year, the appetite and interest to work together, even on previously bipartisan supported bills, is not likely until at minimum after the election. And so with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, that reconciliation package, there are going to be very few must-pass legislative vehicles that aren't already mired in kind of some controversy. For instance, the FY23 spending bill, which is a must-pass bill, funding the government. Democrats dropped the Hyde Amendment, which is related to abortion, which is kind of imperializing the bill. So the likelihood of that bill passing and an FY23 bill being in effect come October 1 is unlikely, maybe even unlikely in 2022. So all of that sounds bleak, but I think everything I said before, put that in the back of your mind. As I said before, it's an election year, and if the tea leaves are correct, we will see a flurry of activity to get bills passed before the end of this 117th Congress. And so now there's no time like now more than ever is the time to engage with your members of Congress. Housing production credit issues are well positioned with strong bipartisan support, which is a great thing. And so you can see things like the now expired 12.5 housing credit allocation, as well as a number of other expiring tax provisions be considered for a potential vehicle. And so, as I mentioned before, engaging your members of Congress, right now we're in August recess. Now is a great opportunity to engage with members directly, attend town halls, they're at home, go to events, schedule meetings with district staff, call, email. Members want to hear directly from their constituents, and often. And we have just, immeasurable bills that we have to think about. We have the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, the 12.5% increase that's expired. We want to get to those types of things. And so I would urge everyone, I would urge everyone is engage, call, email, whatever you need to do to reach out to staff, to members, for them to hear directly just how important this issue is. And with that, I will turn to you, Jesse, or whomever.
Yeah.
You know, I do look forward to working with you all, the Housing Development Consortium, and feel free to reach out to me if you have any other questions.
Thanks, Barbara. Looks like there's one in the chat from Ryan Donahue. Says increasing LIHTC is great, but it only helps affordable rental. Are there any plans to support affordable home ownership at the federal level?
I mean, there were bills in Build Back Better that would have gotten to that, or excuse me, provisions within Build Back Better that would have gone to that. There are legislative bills that are still out there and potentially still viable. But again, I think it's just very much in the air, and it requires bipartisan support. The likelihood of things being included in a year-end package is how bipartisanly supported is it?
Barbara, I wonder if you could touch on just what some of those provisions, bills are that would support affordable home ownership at the federal level.
I don't really, honestly, immediately I think of one, but I can't even remember the name of it right now. I'm so sorry, Jesse. I'm like thinking of it and it immediately like slipped my mind.
There's both the new markets tax credit and then the neighborhood homes one.
Yes, neighborhood homes is definitely, thank you, Jesse.
Any other questions? We have a scheduled break and then a return to the panel at 11:30, but still got some time for last minute pressing questions. Okay, Kathleen leaving a comment. It'd be great to see home ownership rise higher. I'll go on a tiny bit of a soapbox here and say, I think it's completely absurd that we still have the like mortgage interest tax deduction that predominantly subsidizes the luxury housing consumption of high income people and basically nothing for affordable home ownership support.
I would agree, Jesse. I'm on your soapbox with you.
Thanks, Barbara. All right. I'll let everyone have a break and return here at 11:30. You know, take some time to stretch a bit, get more coffee, stare out a window. Thank you all to our panelists for joining us. It's been great to have you. Thanks for coordinating with me on this session.
Hey, Jesse, can you hear me? Oh, you can hear me, but I can't hear you. Okay. Hang on.
He's muted.
Oh,
I can hear you, Grace.
Yep.
thank
Yeah,
you.
I can hear you too.
Yep. All right. All right. Welcome back, everyone. All right. This session, panel 2, is all about land use, advancing affordability and equity through land use and zoning. I'm going to kick us off with a bit of an overview of what zoning is, some of its historical backgrounds, how it, yeah, good point, Ryan, and how it plays out in the present day real estate market in Seattle. Then I'll turn it over to Grace Kim to talk us through the Seattle Housing Comprehensive Plan process. Then Rick Mohler to talk about housing benefit districts, Bryce Yaden to speak about the statewide middle housing bill, and Donald King to speak about the Black Home Initiative policy framework and the work of the Nehemiah Initiative. All right, first off, what is zoning? Broadly, it restricts what can be built and where. This means uses, so residential, commercial, industrial, which areas you can have mixed uses in. It restricts density, height, setbacks, lot coverage, floor area ratio, parking requirements, broadly how large buildings are allowed to be and what they can hold. At the right is a map of the current Bellevue zoning, showing all of the area dedicated to single family land in that light yellow, and then the more intensive multifamily and mixed use development in dark brown and orange. So I think it's worth noting how zoning is really a relatively recent intervention into the development of cities. If you're taking the long view, it's been around about 100 years. The industrial era brought huge urban population growth to cities with dense mixed uses. There were very few restrictions on what you could build or where you could build it. The result was streets like this in Mulberry in Little Italy in New York, where the street was sort of a public commons. People would work below where they lived, usually in horrendously overcrowded conditions. And development restrictions consisted mostly of just building codes setting aside a minimum baseline of access to light and air within homes. New York enacted the first zoning code in 1916 as the skyscraper starts arriving on the scene. And you see a desire to, create enough broad access to like public light and step back the buildings as they grow larger. Embedded especially in early zoning was this notion of economic exclusion, of maintaining the single family home as a means of maintaining the class exclusivity of high-end neighborhoods. Seattle adopted its first zoning code in 1923. The proposals utilized ads like this at the left, showing what's an array of actually kind of cute cottages to my eye, arranged densely on a 60-foot wide lot, saying that this condition would be prevented by zoning. The Supreme Court, in its decision in the Village of Euclid, Ohio versus the Ambler Realty Co., solidified the legality of this kind of zoning by use to segregate industrial uses from commercial uses, from the apartment homes from higher end single family homes. The logic was that the segregation of people and uses would be mutually beneficial. And I use this term segregation pretty deliberately because it was also explicitly about racial segregation. before 1917, many cities, especially in the South, had these explicitly racial zones. This one's from Birmingham, which decided to just completely ignore the rule of law and continue to have racial zoning, restricting where Black people could live and separating them from white people. Lasted up through the 50s. Most cities, however, weren't as explicit in using zoning to segregate by race, instead utilizing the first residence districts, the early progenitor of single-family zoning, to accomplish much of the same goal alongside other policies such as redlining and racially restrictive covenants. So here I've gone ahead, and as of yesterday, this is a map of all of the apartments that are affordable at less than $1,700, roughly the maximum amount that is affordable at 80% area median income. And then here's the zoning code overlay. What you can see is basically that there are, to a first approximation, no affordable homes in single family zones. I looked into it, and those two ones that are in single family zones are grandfathered apartments. Broadly, zoning restricts who can live where and what can be built where. And here's an example for Bellevue too. I had to bump the rent level up because it's more expensive. It's up to $2,250, or what's affordable at 100% area median income. Again, restricting who can live where, what can be built where. Finally, I'll note that land use is necessary but not sufficient for building affordable housing. You can't build affordable housing in single family zoned land. However, you also need the funding. What you can see in this comparison at the left between the right showing where in Seattle you can build multifamily developments, and then at the left where actual affordable apartments are located. Broadly, there's a tight nexus, but from my experience in affordable housing development, I know that it takes more than just a site being zoned properly. That said, it is about the broader amount of growth that can be accommodated within a city. And here I'm going to turn it over to Grace to talk about the specifics of Seattle's comprehensive plan major update.
Thanks, Jesse. And I am, oops, I'm not sharing yet. Okay, and I am here as a board member of HDC and a former planning commissioner, but I will say that there are also two current planning commissioners on this call, Rick Mohler and Patience Malava. So hopefully if I misspeak that they can jump in and correct me. But I will just start by saying that the comprehensive plan is a big wonky document that before I was on the planning commission, I was like, what is this and why do I care? And it's basically a document that guides the policy and guides a lot of things, but sort of how the city will develop. And unlike other cities, well, no, maybe not unlike other cities, the planning commission is actually the body that stewards and shepherds the comprehensive plan and is responsible for how it develops and evolves, with obviously help from staff at Office of Planning and Community Development. So I'm going to try to stay really high level and not get into the weeds. But one of the things to sort of segue from what Jesse was just saying, the land use maps are what we are familiar with working with whenever any affordable housing developer starts off looking at land. They're looking at lands that are not in single family zones probably, but in multifamily or commercially zoned properties, places where affordable housing or multi-story buildings are allowed outright. Yeah, I I won't go into elaborating what Jesse just said, but the zoning is very much intended to place people in the various parts of the city that was desired initially. So the difference between zoning, the land use map as it is today, sort of the zoning map, which is on the left, versus what is in the comp plan, which is the future land use map. Seems like it should be the same thing, similar thing, and slightly different, and yet they're slightly different. So the zoning is like the neighborhood commercial, 1, 2, and 3. It's the mid-rise, the low-rise, those zones that we are familiar with using when we're trying to develop properties. And I'm sorry to be very Seattle centric, but this is the Seattle comp plan, which is why, but this translates to other jurisdictions and other cities. So zoning is on the left, and then on the right is the future land use map. And that future land use maps is in the comprehensive plan and can be sort of morphed and changed in comprehensive plan amendment cycles. So there's an amendment cycle every year. And then we're in the midst now of a major plan update. So every 10 years, there is a significant update to the comprehensive plan. Seattle's comprehensive plan was started in 1994. We had a major update in 2004 and then in 2014. And in the comprehensive plan, there are areas, I'm just going to point out. So like the dark blue is the urban centers. Those urbans are comprehensive strategy for the comprehensive plan is urban villages and urban centers. And I'll talk a little bit about the flaws or drawbacks about that. But you can see kind of where those dark blue and blue areas are. Those are the urban centers, hub urban villages. And then even when you start looking at the light blue, those are the residential urban villages. Those map directly onto the zoning where multifamily commercial zones exist. And downtown is purple, and Seattle, South Lake Union is Seattle mixed. Those are still sort of multifamily. They allow for more office uses, but it's sort of the same thing. From our standpoint, you could consider them sort of orange. So they map very closely together. And there is the ability, if you make a change in the future land use map or the flume, you can impact what happens with zoning down the road. I should have had this slide first. So so the comprehensive plan is basically the city's tool for managing growth. And that's why we have the urban village strategy. You could, sprawl out forever, but the city decided back in 1994 that they were going to have this urban village strategy, and we're going to concentrate development in little pockets, right? In little pockets that are not single family. So it was a strategy to increase the density and do it in a place that is protecting home ownership. We are in a once in a decade opportunity to make a significant change. I will say that we can be aspirational in the changes that we make. In 2004, when there was a major update, they chose to focus very, very heavily on sustainability. And you can see over the last 20 years, almost 20 years, how the city has made significant investments and priorities related to sustainability. In 2014, the Planning Commission made a very, very concerted effort to increase or to focus on racial equity instead of, So that was the main thrust of the 2014 plan. And so we have an opportunity as we revisit that again to figure out what is the new priority or the new strategy that is going to be in place. If you think about 2014, and think about all of the racial equity toolkits and the initiatives and all of the things that were in place before, but have been given more emphasis and encouragement and priority, not only in policies, but also in legislation and things like that. That's really how the comp plan is used. It's sort of the framework that then all of the city council members and the staff and all of the folks that work at the city can use that policy framework or that framework to develop policy and legislation and development standards, quite frankly, that can be used to shape the city. I will say that most people, and as an architect and an affordable housing advocate, when I first started on the planning commission, I was like, okay, well, if these are the elements, and that's what the left-hand side is in the comprehensive plan, this is sort of the table of contents. The neighborhood plans were done in 1994. They're probably never going to change, so you can kind of just ignore those in my mind. The ones on the left, and I'm sure the neighborhood advocates will hate and cringe to hear me say that, but on the left-hand side, the planning, the elements are the things that will be actively changed and updated every year. And in this planning cycle or in this draft cycle, this is where to make significant impacts. I early on thought, oh, as a housing advocate, I care about these two areas. And actually, I didn't even have growth strategy in my list at the beginning. I was like, oh, it's all about housing. Well, in reality, when you look at a number of different aspects that housing touches, it actually is all of these other areas. Like aside from container ports and probably shorelines, the comp plan affordable housing is impacted by all of these other things, right? So where the future land uses are, how transportation intersects, how the capital facilities, which are like parks and fire stations and schools and things like that, where those facilities are located, the utilities, economic development, we can read through the list. All of these things intersect directly with the housing that we try to provide in a very meaningful and sort of culturally and user appropriate way. Okay, so the important thing is to remember, we're not trying to just influence one or two of these things. If you have a specific constituent population of like, you know, our community is concerned not only about the housing, but like the economic health of the local small businesses, like for example, in the Chinatown International District area. That is not then just about housing, it's about economic development, it's about the infrastructure, it's about how transit is intersecting with those things in that neighborhood. So really, you know, and community well-being and community engagement, those are things that I think all of us probably care about to some level or a degree or another. So I just encourage you all, as you're thinking about the comp plan and how you might interact with it, to think more broadly than just housing and growth. But that is where most housing people go. This is the timeline for what the process is right now. So even though they said the last draft was 2014, it took about 3 or 4 years before that to actually do the work and prepare the draft that became adopted for 2014. So we're in that process now. The goal is to have something ready for 2024, but there is a lot of work that's happening at this present moment. The EIS scoping, and I'm not going to get into too wonkiness. If hopefully you know what EIS is. If you don't, feel free to contact me offline. But the scoping process started and was made public so that people could make comment about, like, are you including the right things to study in the environmental impact statement? So that process was, or that scoping period was extended to August 22nd. So there's still time to go in and influence or impact the things that will be studied in terms of the environmental impacts. I'm going to try to stay super high level. This was the chart that was provided. And I should also disclose, I am on the consultant team that is looking at this EIS scope. And I'm using all publicly available documents. So I'm trying to be very, very transparent about my role in this. But I have a very small sort of like community-based racial equity sort of lens that I'm looking at it in. So the 5 alternatives that were published, there's always a no action with any sort of environmental impact statement. So there's a no action, which is like, if we kept going at the same way that we're going now, what does that look like as sort of a benchmark? And then there were 4 other alternatives that were proposed. And this is so tiny that I'm going to break it down in a little bit more detail. But these little diagrams actually are super helpful. So like from the little squinty thing that you're looking at on the screen, this kind of tells you what the no action is. It's currently major clusters of urban centers and urban villages, and that's where all the growth is currently targeted to go. This focused alternative, okay, so these things kind of describe, I should have put these on the next slides, but whatever, kind of graphically describe how the alternative could be applied. So alternative 2 was this more like add more urban villages. Oops, sorry about that. Don't know what happened. So that's what alternative 2 is. So the current urban villages are located like this around the city, and you can see the shape of them are not always kind of amorphous blobs. Sometimes they are very linear. You'll see like up here at Greenwood Finney or at Upper Queen Anne. They started off as like, arterials or spines, and then they, over time those kind of mushroomed out and became more regular shapes, or in some cases didn't due to other factors. But alternative 2 is saying, let's expand the ones that we have already and create new ones. And the focus being to create a 15-minute walk shed around frequent transit. That could be both light rail stations or frequent bus services or the bus rapid transit lines. They're encouraging mid to high-rise zoning. And one of the components of this is that it's creating primarily new rental housing. Some considerations to think about is that this focuses all of the affordable housing into dense neighborhoods. And the reality is that everybody, regardless of income, likes choice. So limiting all of the choice that low and moderate income people have to only being in apartments that you can rent in high density neighborhoods doesn't feel very equitable. So you're limiting housing variety, you're limiting neighborhood choice. And there's certainly, I wrote limited, very little opportunity for homeownership. It has also been noted that the urban village strategy is very exclusionary. And I want to take a quick segue because Jesse mentioned this. In 2021, Seattle Times wrote about this, and there was an article about it. But basically, the urban village strategy has been sort of it sounded great at the beginning, but really the whole point was to keep people out of those single family neighborhoods. The single family neighborhoods back in 1994 and even in 2004 were supposed to be protected. Those were literal words that were in the comprehensive plan to protect homeowners. And that language has been stricken, hopefully all of it, but maybe some of it still lingers. But really the urban village strategy was really to concentrate the lower income, higher density into those specific urban villages. So there's a little bit of flaw of just doing that. And also like the reality of like limiting choice and limiting the housing type that people can have access to. So if you couldn't tell, my bias is really not in favor of that one. Alternative 3, broad growth strategy, is really about providing a wider range of missing middle housing. So having more choice in terms of housing types. So having the ability for row houses or stacked flats, sixplexes, courtyard apartments, all things that used to exist in single family neighborhoods. And you could find evidence of these in all of the older neighborhoods, in older single family neighborhoods. You'll run across something and be like, wow, what is this little cute bungalow court doing here? Or what is this 3-story apartment, brick apartment building doing in this single family neighborhood? It's because those things existed before 1923. And so they were just grandfathered in. So we're just saying this strategy says, let's allow those things to happen again. And with those types of housing options, there could be the possibility, potential for increasing home ownership opportunities. The other thing it allows for is expanding choice to all neighborhoods. So instead of limiting it to just the urban villages, there could be some opportunity to look at slightly higher density, not high density, but sort of low density, lower densities, but still more density than a single family house in many of the neighborhoods. So it's also addressing that exclusionary nature of the current zoning. And I think an important thing is providing more housing options near existing parks and amenities like schools or libraries or other public amenities that the public has invested in. Alternative 4 is the corridor growth strategy. So walk sheds around transit. So more in nodes, like if there's a transit station, let's do a greater walk shed around that transit station instead of doing the arterial. So as we're creating new urban villages, if that was a thing to do, let's not string it out along a transit corridor like City Way or SR 99. yes, it's great to have people near transit, and we also know that those arterials have a lot of environmental impacts. And if you are along that corridor, but you can't actually get onto the bus or the train, then what good does it do? You actually need to be at the station area. So really thinking about focusing housing, not on, oh, that's a typo. It should say focusing housing not on corridors, but at station areas or neighborhood core kind of locations. And then alternative 5 provides additional flexibility. So this alternative promotes abundant housing in all neighborhoods, a greater range of rental and homeownership options, and assumes that the house, this is getting really wonky, but not to all of the other options say, okay, housing is going to, or population is going to grow at this steady rate. And we have seen over the last, I think the first 5 years of the last comp plan, we like met the housing demand that they were expecting over a 20-year period in like 5 years. So this says, okay, let's not look at the projections and pretend that it's going to grow like this, and just acknowledge that it's doing this. And let's try to encourage housing production to actually meet that population demand. Okay, and then I'm probably at the end of my time, so just going to wrap up. Alternative 6 is this combined growth strategy. This is something that HDC is advocating for, or would like to advocate for, and could include 4 to 6 apartment buildings in all neighborhoods. That might be a stretch, but it's certainly something that we can ask the city to study, right? These are not things that will happen. It's more, will you study these things to see what will happen? So then that can be part of the environmental impact statement. We could ask the city to consider a bonus for affordable housing by right. You don't have to get special approval, and to consider ground floor commercial and community spaces to serve daily needs, right? So, so I'll stop there. These are things that Jesse's shared with me that are sort of natural outgrowths of what could be advocated for. And this is a chance that we have as an industry of the affordable housing industry to make comment, to ask the city and their consultants to think about these other pieces. This is the best time to be informing it, not to be reactionary after the fact, but to say, you know, can we look at these things to see what the impact of these things is now? Because it's not a guarantee that all 5 of these alternatives are included in the study. Based on the comment, it could be that we move forward with 3 or 4 of the alternatives, or all of them. I'm guessing it might not be likely to do all of them, but what do we as an affordable housing industry want to see happen? Well, want to see studied so that we can understand that everybody could broadly understand the impact of what that would mean. Okay, I think that's it. There's other things that we could talk about, but I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Grace. And yes, I'll just emphasize that the concepts Grace has just provided are they are our HDC comments, specific comments on how to expand what the city is currently scoping out as growth alternatives, how to promote like more abundant rental and home ownership options throughout the city, and how to improve each of the alternatives to be as equitable as possible. I'm going to turn it over now to Rick Mohler to present about housing benefit districts.
Now I should be unmuted. Thanks, Greg. I can't resist the opportunity. I apologize, Jesse, but I taught a graduate level architecture research studio and seminar last spring focused on the comprehensive plan major update and looking at the re-establishment of missing middle housing types in neighborhoods throughout the city. And I am in the process of building a pavilion that will exhibit the work that will be at the Seattle Design Festival at Lake Union Park on August 20th and 21st from 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. It's going to be really trying to demystify and de-wonkify the question of the comp plan major update as it applies to missing middle housing typologies. So if you are so inclined, please come by and check it out. Okay, enough of my plug. So I'm Rick Mohler. I am an architect. I teach at the University of Washington. As Grace mentioned, I serve on the Seattle Planning Commission. Grace didn't say that she's actually a former chair of the commission. I am currently co-chairing the commission, although I'm not wearing that hat today. Today, I am talking about sound communities. Many of you are probably familiar with this. Some of you might not be. So I'll say that sound communities is a group of volunteers from the private, nonprofit, public, and academic sectors. And we are focused on leveraging our historic investment in light rail and bus rapid transit to build complete walkable communities with an abundance of housing, in particular, affordable housing at transit stations as we expand our transit system on a regional level. I should say that fundamental to this, at the very core of this, this is a land banking strategy. What we are primarily focused on is transferring ownership from the private sector to the community sector in the interest of greatly expanding affordable housing at all of our transit hubs. Why am I not advancing here? There we go. So this is basically what I'm going to be talking about. First, the need, then the tool that we are employing in realizing this vision, which is the Housing Benefits District, answers to some questions to date and some outstanding concerns and questions that we're continuing to work on. And then there probably should be a number 5, which is introducing some new tools that we've been developing over the past few months. So the need and the opportunity is to get in front of displacement and other community impacts at these station areas. In other words, to acquire land before the market drives the cost of that land out of reach for affordable housing. To alleviate housing price pressure, to ensure that we have housing of all types, both more affordable housing, more total housing, greater variety, not just number, but greater variety of housing types. And we see this as a solution that is scalable, bold, and collaborative. We really think this is a big idea that is operating at scale we need to be considering given the magnitude of the housing crisis that we're facing within our region. So the Housing Benefit District, we've been working on getting legislation passed to create the Housing Benefit District. House Bill 1880 would enable local governments to fund land acquisition around transit centers for low-income and middle-income housing, as well as community development projects. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. This was heard in 2020, 2021, and 2022. There has been growing support each year. Last year, we passed the House Local Government Committee, but it stalled in finance. But again, there's growing interest in this, and we're becoming increasingly confident that we will get this legislation passed. So how does the Housing Benefit District work? First is we're interested in local governments that have demonstrated a commitment to increasing urban residential capacity. This relates very much to what Grace was just talking about. Jurisdictions that have zoned the area around our transit investment to allow for the quantity and variety of housing that is really needed and required at those investments. The funding is local government council establishes a housing benefit district whose boundaries are coextensive with the local government's boundaries, and the housing benefit district seeks voter approval for taxing and bonding authority. These funds are applied towards station area. This is a half-mile radius around the transit center to produce a mix of housing minimum of 5% affordable to extremely low income, 10% affordable to very low income, 19% affordable to low income, and 33% affordable to middle income. Part of our vision for the complete community is that there is a mix of incomes. These are genuinely mixed income neighborhoods that we will be building at these transit stations. So in advance of the station opening, the Housing Benefit District applies funds towards station area land assembly and infrastructure investment. The station area land is then held, and it is sold at a discounted rate for affordable housing, but some of the land is held and sold at market rate, with the proceeds from that sale going back into the system to provide deeper discounts for affordable housing development. So as part of this, a couple of years ago, several of us worked with Master of Real Estate students at the UW. We've been working with 3 partner cities right now, Tacoma, Everett, and Renton. And so we had students do an analysis of what would be the impact of the Housing Benefit District in 3 case study station areas. So here on the left, you see a land use map for the Everett station. And on the right, you see a number of sites that the real estate students identified for potential acquisition over a 0 to 5 year, 6 to 10 year, 11 to 15 year, and 16 to 20 year time frame. In other words, we're looking at 5-year cycles happening over 20 years in terms of land acquisition. And based on the assumptions and the modeling that the students did, the impact is pretty significant. In other words, no intervention versus the intervention of the Housing Benefit District does yield some pretty impressive results. The total amount of housing produced over that 20-year time frame is about 72% more. There's actually a reduction in the amount of market rate housing, but a nearly 3-fold increase in middle income housing, a more than doubling of low income housing, again, an almost 3-fold increase in very low income housing, and 728 units of extremely low income housing that would occur at the station area with the Housing Benefit District intervention versus no intervention at all. So we had a number of questions, and these are some of the answers. Where do excess proceeds from sales to market rate developers go? Again, they are used to fund the purchase of additional sites in subsequent investment cycles, as well as infrastructure improvements. In terms of infrastructure improvements, again, the vision of the complete community, they could be physical infrastructure improvements like parks and open space, could be bike lanes and sidewalks to provide safe access to the transit for pedestrians and cyclists, but they could also be social infrastructure investments. Things like Seattle's Equitable Development Initiative would be an example of that. So why would there be a discount to developers creating middle income housing? Again, the current strategies are not producing the middle income housing units that we need for the segment of the population that can't qualify for low income housing and can't afford market rate housing. And so creating that middle income housing also creates a pathway for people to move from low income housing to another housing type when their incomes increase. Are we looking at models for home ownership that is specified? Yes, the current bill includes assessing alternate pathways to ownership models such as community land trusts and limited or shared equity cooperatives as part of the station area planning. So what about places that are highly unaffordable already? Well, the goal of the Housing Benefits District is to invest in land acquisition around transit hubs in advance of the development of those station areas before market pressures drive the costs out of reach. So for that reason, we expect this model to work best in areas outside of Seattle, which is why we've been looking at Tacoma, Everett, and Renton as case studies. Why are we not providing resources for vertical development? Well, there are a number of tools already available for construction, and we really see the urgency and focus as being on acquiring key properties before they appreciate out of reach for affordable housing. And this initial investment has the potential to incentivize new funding for vertical investment. And so is the housing benefit district for land outside of what Sound Transit buys, and how do they work together? The answer is yes, the housing benefit district is for land outside of ST properties. And we see this as complementing Sound Transit's 80-80-80 affordability requirement to ensure that the entire station area, not just ST properties, include affordable housing. So if you look, for example, at Cedar Crossing at the Roosevelt station, which everyone's very excited about, but with an HBD, there might be 3, 4, 5 of those projects and not just one on the ST property. I am not going to get into these bullet points because I don't have time, but just to let you know, there are still outstanding concerns that we're continuing to study. We are working with our partner cities. We are working with other stakeholders. We are working with state legislators to address a lot of these concerns. So finally, over the past few months, past year really, with the help of a substantial amount of funding from the Washington State Department of Commerce, we have been developing a series of tools that will help jurisdictions match major transit investment with a more proactive approach to planning, land banking, and building more housing, especially affordable housing and station areas. And those tools are an action guide, which we will be releasing shortly. We're just finalizing it now, titled Sound Investments, Sound Communities. Station area knowledge base that we've been developing with Moll, Foster, Alongi, and an impact model that will help jurisdictions determine the most effective way to leverage revenue through the housing benefit district strategy. And we've been working on that with Echo Northwest. So first, the action guide is a how-to manual with chapters on planning and design, preventing displacement, and implementation. The station area knowledge base is a tool that includes demographic, housing, land, and displacement risk profiles for each station area and a wide array of search filters to help jurisdictions really understand what's happening within the station area, how to minimize displacement pressure, and how to identify potential sites for acquisition. So, for example, here is a screenshot profile for the Federal Way Transit Station. On the left, we see station area demographics. On the right, we see housing capacity. But the complete profile includes maps of amenities, education level, additional info on property, and the like. So here's a screenshot map for Shoreline at 185th. In red, you see Sound Transit property. In green, you see properties with additional capacity of 100 to 200 units and a property appraised value ratio of less than 50%. In other words, potential candidates for acquisition. And it also shows their relationship and how they might dovetail with the Sound Transit properties that could be developed for affordable housing. But you could also filter by property ownership, government and religious property, years owned, and the like, a wide variety of filters that can be used to help jurisdictions best understand what's really going on in these station areas. And then the impact model, which has a set of shared assumptions, which you can see on the left, and then helps jurisdictions determine what is the most impactful way of leveraging the revenue that they're generating specifically within those communities. So there are two scenarios here. Scenario A is a mixed portfolio focused on value recapture. So we have a split, an equal split between low-income workforce and market rate housing, versus scenario B, which is an affordable portfolio with a deeper discount for affordable housing. So you're looking at low income and workforce housing split 50-50. So in scenario A, the mixed portfolio value recapture, you can see that the total amount of capital that can be placed is pretty substantial. And this is because you can reinvest revenue that is generated by the sale to market rate developers. The total land purchase is about 30 acres. The potential housing unit capacity is about 4,600, and the land subsidy per unit is about $4,800. Whereas in the affordable portfolio with the deeper discount, you can see that the total capital placed is less. the total land purchased is less, and the potential housing unit capacity is also less, but the land subsidy per unit is substantially more. So what this tool does is it allows jurisdictions to look at a whole host of different scenarios and how it would play out over, say, 20 years with these 5-year cycles. I'm going to close. I'm sorry, I started with a plug, and I'm going to close with a plug, which is that my colleagues on the Sound Community Steering Committee, I'm going to be in class, I won't be there, but we will be presenting at the Housing Washington Conference on October 3rd. And unlike our typical presentations where we only have about 10 minutes like I have had today, we will have a full hour. And it'll be a great opportunity to really get deep into the details, deep into the weeds on Housing Benefits District and how this really it can be, and we hope will be, a bold strategy for addressing our housing affordability needs at scale at a regional level. So thanks.
Thanks, Rick. Look forward to seeing the full presentation at Housing Washington, and hopefully see a bunch of people there. I'm going to turn it over now to Bryce to talk about the prospects for statewide middle housing bill.
Thanks, Jesse. You're going to pull up my thing for me. Thank you. Appreciate it. Just as a quick background, my name is Bryce Yaden. I am a government affairs consultant. I do lobbying for land use, housing, and transportation for the past 8 years. That's been my focus. I've been around the legislature for well over 15. And again, this kind of tends to be my focus area, and I've really enjoyed it. As Jesse said, I'm here to discuss missing middle housing and kind of what's going on. It's kind of already been touched on today, but I did want to just kind of go over some basics before we kind of get into what's coming up in 2023. What is missing middle housing or moderate density housing? I'm actually sitting on a Commerce guidance task force right now regarding the update to the housing element of the GMA, and we're kind of debating on language used across a whole host of things. But I think the best way to look at it is things from duplex all the way up to a sixplex, cottage apartments or cottage housing. Those are the vast majority of what we talk about when we're discussing it. I have 3 photos here because I really want to indicate what it looks like to have this type of housing and how it looks identical to most single family zoning. The very top larger picture, that's actually a 4-plex. There are 4 units within that that people live in. The one on the bottom left is a stacked triplex. So each floor has its own unit. It has a shared walkway, kind of how it works. And then the one on the bottom right is a duplex. Now, all of these take up the same land space typically of a 3,000 to 5,000 square foot lot that most single family homes do, that range anywhere from 1,500 square feet up to 3,000 square feet. But we're using this as an infill or moderate density to actually increase housing opportunity, both for renters, but also home ownership opportunities. Move to the next slide real quick. You've seen the map on the left from 2 different people, so I think we're all hanging out understanding what the biggest issue is. That's actually a map of the city of Seattle, and all of that light yellow is where single family zoning is allowed, where no other housing, unless it's been grandfathered in, is allowed. So that's the vast majority of the city. When we're talking about a city of well over, around 750,000 or above, when the vast majority of our land is single family zoning, we realize that we have great inequities, both in the cost and availability of housing for folks, but also where people live on arterials and other things. And Grace talked extensively and did a great job of explaining why that can be a bad thing if we're concentrating housing in certain areas. The second chart came from the Seattle Times a couple of days ago, or maybe a week ago. And they actually did a great job at breaking down over the last, between 2012 and 2019, the housing needs and how we're actually have a greater housing shortage over the last well, more than 7 years, but this takes a look at 7 years between 2012 and 2019. And this doesn't just focus on Washington, but it shows how great it is in general in the Northwest. We have places that have, you know, Bend has an 8.2% housing deficit. That's a really big number. Places like Spokane and Spokane Valley, when in 2012 they almost had a surplus, basically, they now have a loss of housing. They have a greater need for it. So this happened in every jurisdiction. You'll see that the increased need across it. We know that people are moving in droves to the Pacific Northwest. And that's why we talk consistently about how do we change our zoning to allow more housing opportunity. It's not about removing the current housing options. You can always have single family homes, but it's really about opening opportunity for other folks. And this underproduction is going to continue if we're not starting to address it from a statewide level. And one thing I do want to mention is when we start looking at areas that people want to live in, Seattle, Tacoma, Everett, Bellevue, you know, we really talk about those population centers. As they restrict housing, it puts pressure on every other city to either make up that gap in difference or actually help support it. So what we're talking about is every time one city decides to not build additional housing units or allow for additional housing units, they're actually impacting the entire state. So I just want to put that out there. Move to the next slide real quick. So really we wanted to talk about past, present, and future. Over the last few years, there has been a concentrated effort at the state level to introduce missing middle housing. Essentially, it would allow you know, everything that I mentioned in the second slide, all the way in every single family zone in Washington. There's been different iterations, things that you have to have a population threshold or other things. Last year was House Bill 1782 and Senate Bill 5670. These were sponsored by Representative Bateman and Senator Mona Doss. And they were at the request of the governor. So the governor has a keen interest in adding housing, and he looks at it from a climate perspective as well as an affordability perspective. A couple other pieces is the policy issues within it. Last year, as the bill kind of tried to move through the process, there was a lot of pushback politically on what consists of or what should be allowed when we're talking about rezones. The House bill ended up at one point amended to only allow duplexes and triplexes within a half a mile or a quarter of a mile of transit. Now, this kind of goes backwards to what Rick Mohler was talking about when we talk about trying to use our nodes for transit centers as hubs for housing, and really kind of upends what we're trying to achieve when we talk about housing affordability and missing middle. Really, it's about, again, allowing housing options throughout an entire city that frees up opportunity for affordable home ownership, which might not already be allowed. Some of the biggest political issues that we run into with this is the discussion of parking or the discussion of infrastructure or parks or other things. And one thing that we've noticed, especially if you want to look at that city of Seattle map, all of our largest parks in the city of Seattle are actually surrounded by single family homes for the most part. Things like Discovery Park, Lincoln Park, and others. The vast majority of them are surrounded by single family homes, and those are our largest parks. We really need to be utilizing those to the best of our ability. So moving on, that was last year. In 2023, there's going to be a new group of policies that are going to come out. I've been having conversations with folks like Representative Bateman and others about what the policy could look like. We don't have a hard and fast policy yet. It hasn't been developed. There's conversations going along with cities, counties, and other stakeholders to try and figure out what would be an overarching policy outcome that we would strive to achieve. Things, as I mentioned, affordability and other things. We're going to run into the same political issues. And one of the things that we've been discussing internally and externally, and someone brought up the other day in another meeting I was at, is there's a lot of desire to protect single family homes because people view them as that's what's affordable. That's what used to be affordable. Jesse also showed the cost of single family homes these days. And when you actually compare that to the cost of a townhome or a duplex or a triplex, there's actually a significant gap between the cost for those, both in building, land utilization, but also outcomes in terms of how much their cost to purchase. But one thing that we want to allow for greater housing availability and options isn't necessarily to say that every house is going to be affordable to every income level. It's about slowing the speed of increase. We're seeing 30% increases year over year in places in Seattle. I mean, even the house I live in went up about 28% in a single year, which is just absurd when we're actually trying to get people into housing. So what we're trying to do is not say that every new unit has to be $600. It's saying that every unit that's been built shouldn't be raising at 30% a year, and we have to figure that out. So those are some of the policy and legislative issues that we're facing. Jump to the next slide real quick. So this was where I come with you guys and kind of wanted to present some ideas that are out there. We're trying to set the stage for success. I kind of mentioned some of that in terms of the messaging we're trying to use, the outcomes we're trying to associate with this, and really trying to get a place where housing is built for all income levels and we're not leaving people behind, which is what we do right now. We need to build on our previous efforts. We know where some of the political gaps are. We know some members that stand in the way of significantly changing the way we look at housing production in Washington. But in addition to that, we need to build real power, and that power has to come from everybody, from those who are seeking larger lots and houses, all the way down to those who just want to live within a place that they can walk and bike and take transit everywhere. And so we need to build on what happened last year. Again, it fell flat. It died in the Senate Ways and Means Committee. It the House version died on the floor, kind of in appropriations, but also kind of died in the local government committee. So we know that there's a big task ahead of us. But that's where it kind of comes to potential roles for HDC members in this. And I think Ryan, I know Ryan's on this and he's got some great ideas, and he actually put a couple of comments in the chat, which is about, how do we actually move towards affordable home ownership? And duplexes and triplexes, townhomes are one option to do that. And advocating for these things is going to be extremely important as we move forward, that we're actually putting housing, home ownership out of reach if we're not building new types of housing and a diverse set of housing types across the state. So that's kind of where we're looking at some of the HDC members, but also something Jesse said that was really impactful in his beginning, which was, this isn't, one of the issues with affordable housing is where we've restricted its building. We've restricted in certain areas because that's how the funding can get high enough to actually build out affordable housing. But what we're trying to do is figure out, how do we get more affordable housing across the entire city, and how do we drive down costs so affordable housing can be built by different types instead of just apartments all the time. Nothing wrong with apartments, I love them. So thinking about it that way. And then I did want to quickly touch base that, as this moves forward, I think we're going to see a big bill package on housing coming up next year. Something that will address the zoning issues, not just single family, but around transit and density. You heard about the Sound Communities Initiative with the housing benefit districts. There's going to be new revenue that's going to be needed. House Bill 1220 passed a couple years ago. The Department of Commerce is starting to issue numbers on how much affordable housing we need. And the latest numbers that I saw are about $20 billion over 5 years. And we're obviously not going to raise that right away, but kind of the scope of what we're facing. And we're also going to have to do something on tenant protections. One of those alone isn't going to solve our problem. So we have to make sure that as a group and as a community, we see this as a package. We see something on zoning, something on funding, and something on tenant protections to come together. So that's kind of a real quick rundown of what we have. I know we're kind of squeezing on time, so I apologize, and I can chat more later.
Thanks, Bryce. It was great. Can feel free to leave any questions in the chat and we'll try and answer them, but I think we need to move on to our final presentation. of the panel in the day by Donald King. He's going to speak about, we've been talking about about land use policy, zoning, everything that governs the rules of where you can build. And he's going to delve into like more of the on the ground, what do zoning restrictions and relaxations actually mean in terms of affordable housing development, and also this nexus with historically Black churches in the Central District in South Seattle.
Well, thank you, Jesse, and thanks to the previous speakers. This is great presentations, great information that we got from all of you, and a great deal of work too. My presentation will be probably less policy. I'm probably less of a policy wonk and more of a visionary. So I don't have all the numbers and metrics and graphs, but here's one. So this is the Black Home Ownership Initiative, which I, as one of the founders of the Nehemiah Initiative, and the Nehemiah Initiative is really focused on the development of historically Black church property for affordable housing in a goal to both save that that community institution of community held land as well, to develop for affordable housing, to fight against displacement, particularly of African Americans from the central city. The Black Homeowners Initiative is one of those tools that we're looking at in home ownership to build wealth and to have other alternatives to rental housing. A little bit off script here, to let you know, I was a former member of the Seattle Planning Commission back in the late 80s, early 90s, when we did the work of establishing that 1994 comprehensive plan and the urban villages strategy. And one of the things we didn't do at the time that I regret, and I intend to do moving forward in each thing that we look at in policy development and even in vision, is the idea of problem seeking. Where is what we're putting together in policies that we're proposing now going to be a problem in the future? We looked at that little cottage development, which was at that time a problem, was stated as a problem. This is what we don't want. This is some of what we really want now. So attitudes change, situations change, particularly situations around racial equity have changed. And we also want to make sure that what we're doing is not going to be a problem in the future. We can't be perfect with that, but we can do the problem seeking of looking at our policies and finding out, where can this go wrong? How can this be harmful to one group or another, or of communities in general? So with the Black Home Ownership Initiative, we have a 7-point plan to be able to deliver 1,500 home ownership opportunities in the next 5 years. The Nehemiah Initiative will play a role in that. We believe that with our first 4 projects proposed now, we can deliver about 150 of those units, 10% of the goal of 1,500 within the next 5 years. We can do that by being able to provide the historically Black church property that is underused and is fairly vast and available land for building and committing to affordability in home ownership now. We have churches that are on board with being able to do that. Our first 4 churches are eager to get going, and as I said, can produce about 10% of that goal. So a 7-point plan includes sustaining existing owners and ownership of land, marketing and outreach to potential homeowners that may not know there's opportunities to own a home, may have lost hope in that. Pre, post, and purchase counseling in means and tools to be able to help them get into a home ownership position. Purchase and support tools to also help them after there's home ownership. And also to be able to help them with credit building and preparedness for credit and lending. Housing production, something we all talk about, and different means of housing production different alternatives to housing production. How do we get away from what I feel is one of the errors that we've made in density setting in the original comprehensive plans that saw the production of these massive block developments of apartments, of rental apartments, some of them affordable rental apartments, but really nothing between that and the $1 million townhomes next to them. No middle housing, no middle income housing, no home ownership opportunities. So the policies and practices and the intersections of what we have now and we're looking at in the new comprehensive plan need to take into consideration all of those intersections, all of the alternatives for types of housing and choices in housing, but also in correcting some of the inequities, some of the harm and the legacy we've had from previous policies that many times were done with intentions and good intentions, even though those intentions may have been racially biased. So next slide, please. What we're looking at and what I'd said is we have property available in our historic Black churches. Rick, I want to talk to you later about what you're doing for in the Lake Union presentation on missing middle housing, because this is something, again, we'd like to look at. We're looking at exploring that. We have one church that has 77,000 square feet of property with about 35, not even 35,000, about 35,000 that has uses now, but the majority of it's parking. We have about 15,000 square feet of that 77,000 square feet that is actually used by buildings, used by the church buildings. So there is land available. There's land available for churches that are committed to being able to provide opportunities for affordable home ownership on their surplus of land. We have, as I said, 4 projects right now where that is possible for developing 150 units. So did we have another slide there, Jesse? This is Damascus International Fellowship, which also has a lot of land. This is the property that I mentioned to you before. This is the Tabernacle Missionary Baptist Church, South Jackson Street. The northern parcel of this property sits on Jackson, is an NC 75 zone. With the religious organization owned property ordinance and the equitable development, equitable zoning project as a pilot project to study this site in looking at a variety of housing types, missing middle housing, as we move from the highest density of this site to the south, which is neighboring more middle density and single family home densities, how we can develop this site as a mix, how we can study this site as an opportunity for middle income housing, missing middle housing, and home ownership, along with rental properties. So what we have here in using this religious organization owned property ordinance that we just passed last summer, nicknamed the ROOP, we can have the advantage of developing this NC zone to 85 feet. Now, that gives us flexibility. It may not be something we want to use all of that density allowance, but it does give us the flexibility to be able to develop that property. Now, the strange thing in this, which relates to the equitable zoning project, is just south of those major buildings that you can see there. I don't even know if you can see my cursor. Just south of the major buildings, which are the church buildings, some additional parking and other resources to the north of the site, the upper end of the site. Just south of that, that zoning goes from an NC 75 to a single family 5,000. This definitely is an error. This definitely needs to be corrected. Can the church, can the resources of being able to provide affordable housing also be able to afford the upzone that is necessary to provide the density to produce a viable project and to produce the opportunities to look at a variety of housing types on this site without an upzone. In the equitable zoning project and a possible pilot for this site, we're looking at ways to do that that are not as onerous as an upzone process, as onerous, as time consuming, and as costly. So that funding can go more into the affordability of the homes than into the rezoning of the property. So easy and predictable contract rezone process would lead to more affordable homes and improved financial feasibility and viability of the projects. This is something we're promoting now, as well as, you know, the promotion of the use of this property of historically Black churches, develop affordable housing, to also fight displacement of the African American community from the central city. That being said, all of these visionary ideas are also intersecting with policies put forth in the comp plan. And if they're not, they should be. So thank you.
Thanks, Donald. We've got a question from Grace. Is the equitable zoning project limited to church-owned properties? Or
good question.
Faith-based?
You know, it is not. So, but church properties are one of those that could really benefit from it.
I believe it is intended to be paired mostly with projects that fall under the Equitable Development Initiative.
Equitable Development Initiative and projects mainly funded by the Equitable Development Initiative, which do have some focus on, of course, built into its name, inequity. And equity, as I see it, is also related to correction of some of the past harms that were done from other policies in planning and in land use.
We have a comment from Ryan about a similar initiative in Bellevue around upzoning church properties with some affordability requirements and how they've been intentionally underzoned or they have not bumped above single family zoning.
Was that a question? And a question for me, or was that just a comment?
It was just a comment.
Okay.
Ryan, I can unmute you if you want. Yeah.
Yes, Ryan.
No, I was just agreeing with you and unfortunately noting that I wish I could say it was an accident, but it's probably intentional that these religious owned properties were underzoned. So I'm really glad that you're doing this work.
Yeah, they did. Many churches do exist in single family or lower density zones, you know, by being community institutions. The change with the ROOP for some of our church properties that were in low-rise zones, for example, went from being non-financially feasible to being feasible with that ordinance.
Okay, thank you, Donald.
Okay, thank you.
I think it's been a great, oh, Rick has a question. Go ahead.
Is that okay?
Yep.
So Donald, I had a question about the significant amount of surface parking that's on some of these sites, and we're having a pretty interesting, I'll say even lively conversation in the Planning Commission right now about repurposing the public right-of-way, shifting focus away from cars, but also acknowledging the displacement issue that we have folks who have been displaced from the city to auto-dependent locations, and their primary access to the city may require a car. And I'm assuming that's the case for at least some of the congregation at these churches. And so I'm curious of how you're proposing to balance the need to better use the land that's there, while at the same time acknowledging that some folks are going to need to have car access to the church.
Yeah, it is. And, you know, it is a difficult discussion to have with many of the churches, primarily because one, this is property that they've used for parking for decades. They consider it free parking. It's lost opportunity, but for what they know, it's free parking. So when you really talk about building a development and saying, you know, to build this development, you may need, you know, subsurface parking. Those parking spaces may cost you $50,000 bucks each, and that's a shock. It's like, we've gone from free parking to this. Why are we doing this? So once we get into the discussion of alternatives, and many of that happens with working with the leadership, and the leadership then being part of that conversation with the congregation on, let's really take a look at how we use parking and when we use parking, and how we have then passed that opportunity for using that parking lot for other uses that are 24/7, instead of one space that is being used once or twice a week, maybe a little more if there's a funeral or a wedding. Once they look at it from that viewpoint, it's like, that is a lost opportunity. This is something that we have to really grow into. This is an attitude that needs to be changed. What else can we do? Well, in some cases, we can provide some parking. Parking, particularly for those that are less able to walk or ride a bike, like many policy wonks feel, you know, Seattle citizens should do. They should walk. They should ride the bike more often. Well, you know, some people really can't do that. Public transportation, yes, in your Sunday best isn't always the best selling piece. A couple of our churches are near public schools. We intend to talk to the superintendent of Seattle Public Schools about sharing their parking for Sundays and evenings with the churches. For the cost of a parking space, the church can have a very nice van that runs a constant shuttle. So there are ways for people that have to drive the distance, that have been dispersed, that have been displaced, and are out in the Black diaspora of South King County, mostly in Northern Pierce County, that have to drive to church and need a place to park. We need those alternatives. We need to listen to people that aren't the policy wonks and aren't saying, well, you know, we don't like parking and we're not going to have parking, and say, you know, maybe there are some other alternatives to provide parking for those that absolutely need it. But, you know, if we're building housing for those people that are threatened with displacement or have been displaced that are right next to the church, maybe you don't need the parking anymore. Maybe you can now easily walk to church. Maybe you can now enjoy more opportunities to meet and greet and have gatherings and build community around your church and around your church facilities.
Thanks, Donald.
Thanks, Donald. And we are nearing the close of our first day of the Policy Priorities Summit. Thanks again for everyone who has joined us. We have a polling link that I can copy into the chat for you to give feedback, given what you've heard today about what you think how you think our current advocacy agenda adequately reflects the work you'd like to see happen. I'm going to turn it over now to Patience to close us out, reconvene, remind us what we've heard, talk about next steps. Thanks.
Thank you, Jesse. This has been a wonderful policy wonky space, and as expected, it is the policy summit, and that's really where the rubber meets the road in terms of the different policy ideas that we have that are relevant for us to focus on in the next year. Thank you, Grace, Rick, Donald, and Bryce for your presentations in this session on land use policies. I've always noted that this is an area that is the least exciting for people, but what you did with all of your presentations was really generate a lot of energy around middle housing. I think there's an in-depth understanding of how affordability is centralized in comprehensive plans, the importance of engaging on the growth strategy, talking about the housing element, but beyond that, looking at other elements as well, because they do intersect and impact seeing affordability long-term. So this is a great start for all of us. One thing that I will highlight that I had just starting off in the morning with the funding session is we are all clearly committed to increasing funding for affordable housing. We talked about land use being necessary, but also not being sufficient if we don't have the funding to actually support the production and preservation of affordable housing and the necessary operations and services dollars that should be following that. So the Seattle Housing Levy remains a top priority that I think I had just from the presentations that were made, but also from the silent responses that I see in the summit as a nod for that work to move forward. On the Veterans and Human Services Levy, there will be an additional follow-up session to demonstrate support for that levy renewal. There has not been as extensive of groundwork in conversations with the PAG on steps to support that work. But I know there are questions around special population requirements on the capital funding piece that needs to be discussed and elevated. There are interests from the homeownership partners to look at what's possible for homeownership within that tool. And I'm sure conversations will ensure to really proactively identify what's possible within the Veterans Human Services Levy. I think I was really excited to see the progress on the REIT bill being emphasized. That has been an encouraging development to see. And I will be looking at all of you as HDC members to coalesce around the bill and get it across the finish line. I think we have an opportunity to really get it passed in 2023. Then the federal level remains one that we will continue to watch and really stand ready to offer support, elevate our champions. Many of the legislators who are driving the work at the federal level around the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act are our own representatives, and we need to be showing them that support as they drive and move championship around these tools at the federal level. There were new ideas that came up, which is the purpose of such a summit. I think I heard about a lodging tax and doing some research around what's possible there. I know it is a tough time for the tourism industry currently. It is well worth time for us to be looking at what are the possibilities in the realm of over the next few years to look at the lodging tax as a revenue source. We have extensive history as HDC working around that tool, both at the state level and at the local level, and the policy advisory group will be a good place to be doing that further research. And I think that exhausts a number of the revenue tools. I will emphasize that ideas are countless, opportunities to advance tools are countless. What I will encourage you as you prioritize for the advocacy agenda in 2023 is to look at the tool that we can make the most impact in and really coalesce our energy around getting that tool across the finish line. And then I had from the second session, the emphasis on really building strong support around the comprehensive plan update. We have the Seattle work, there's coalition work that is underway. And Grace, thank you for outlining all of the concepts that we've seen so far and where to best invest support. I think the alternative 6 that has been discussed is one that has gotten support beyond just HDC members, but other partners who are also coalescing around it to increase middle housing opportunities for people across the city, as well as multifamily, larger options like high rises or mid rises, as we've emphasized in our comment letter. I also had a strong, I think, element on the HBDs and the work that we've done over the years. We do have an opportunity in 2023 to bring that bill back to session and likely take it across the finish line. And Rick and fellow committee members at Sound Communities have just done extensive work in developing tools like the impact model, like the knowledge-based model, to really provide resources and tools for cities to be looking at how to do TOD proactively and at large scale. So we'll be coalescing around that work, and there will be further discussions within the policy advisory group on what we do on that front. I think there was also clear support for the strategy at the state level of bills that look at funding, bills that look at zoning, as Bryce was laying out, but also looking at tenant protections. And I think there will be conversations as we go through the summit where that gets elevated at some point. And then there's strong support for the BHI policy framework and the work that you are doing around religious organizations, really leaning in to address the affordable housing crisis, Donald. And if we can continue to expand, especially the equitable development zone pilot project that you emphasized, if there's any way that folks can coalesce around that in emphasizing that for the 2023 agenda, I think that's a point of strong interest. I don't believe I missed any other key takeaways from the discussions, but this will be a good time, Jesse, to launch the poll or offer that folks can respond to the poll as a follow-up email to really get responses on how we are prioritizing what we do in the lead agenda, but also what we're thinking about in the support agenda. I will close off by saying that tomorrow we are back for another policy summit session, and this is where we dig in deep into the regulatory challenges that we see accelerating the cost to produce housing, the cost to ensure that we are sustainable as a built environment. And there'll be conversations around the energy code changes that we expect next year. There'll be conversations around permitting and design review with a robust panel to cover a lot of that work. We will also be spending more time, just as a cap and close off, to talk about what we're doing in East King County, advocating for mandatory inclusionary zoning in Bellevue, and then also looking at what we're seeing the cities like Bothell do around middle housing. We'll also shine light on the South King County Housing and Homelessness Partners Capital Fund that we didn't include in the funding sources analysis that you saw today, because it has just been launched and it is an exciting time for the sub-region to have that tool in place. And we would like all of you to be aware of the work they have done and to think about how to leverage that source and bring in additional revenue tools in South King County. With that said, Jesse, over to you, and thank you all for a wonderful day one of a policy summit.
Yes, thank you, Patience. Thanks everyone for attending. I've dropped the summit polling link in the chat. It's just simple SurveyMonkey/r/2023 HDC summit. It runs through our entire advocacy agenda and lets you rank like how supportive you are of each of our lead and support agenda items, and to give some open-ended comments. I'll be sending it also out by email after this to the attendees, and you can feel free to answer it tomorrow, because there are some parts of the agenda that we haven't had the chance to cover yet today and will be covered in the sessions tomorrow. I hope to see as many of you as possible for the sessions tomorrow. I think they should be a great deep dive into the regulatory barriers that affordable housing development faces in terms of not just the zoning, but the permitting of actually building them, as well as a spotlight on the regional work that HDC is leading and partnering on. And with that, any final questions? Okay, in that case, I think we'll close this out. Have a good rest of your afternoon. Thanks, everyone.